the neighbor who mowed his lawn in a Darth Vader costume. So let me tell you about the neighbor I had a couple of years ago. The kind of neighbor that makes you question whether you've stumbled into a sitcom or maybe just a parallel universe where everyone has decided normal behavior is optional. Because this man, and I swear on everything I own, used to mow his lawn in a full Darth Vader costume, helmet and all, cape flapping, dramatically in the suburban breeze, and yes, before you even ask. He had the voice modulator on too, so instead of hearing the usual puttering of a lawnmower, you'd hear the ominous hum of machinery followed by a deep, slightly muffled, "Luke, I am your father," floating across the fence while dandelion seeds scattered in the wind like tiny defeated stormtroopers. Now, I should clarify, this wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't even a Halloween gag. This was his standard Saturday ritual, and what's more, he treated it with a kind of seriousness that made the whole street collectively unsure whether to laugh or to salute. The first time I saw it, I was out on my porch watering my plants, just trying to keep my succulents alive despite my well-established history as a serial plant killer. When suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I caught this dark figure pushing a mower in slow, deliberate rows, cape catching on branches, helmet fogging up in the afternoon sun, and I nearly dropped the watering can on my foot. At first, I thought it was a prank, like maybe the neighborhood kids dared him, or maybe he lost a bet at work. But then the next weekend it happened again, and the weekend after that, and before long it became less of a spectacle and more of a fixture, like, oh yeah, that's just Jerry being Darth Vader again, no big deal. But of course, it was a big deal because people started to gather discreetly at first, peeking through blinds, whispering to each other like we were part of some suburban conspiracy. But eventually, it escalated to lawn chairs and lemonade and the occasional polite golf clap whenever he did a particularly clean mowing line. Because say what you will about Jerry, the man had impeccable lawn care technique, the kind of stripes you only see in professional baseball fields. Except instead of the Chicago Cubs groundskeeper, it was Darth Vader from three doors down. Now, here's where it gets even weirder because kids in the neighborhood started to idolize him. Like, truly idolize him? They'd run around in little plastic lightsabers shouting about the dark side, and parents didn't even try to stop them because, honestly, what do you even say? No, honey, you can't pretend to be Darth Vader while Mr. Henderson is actually out there being Darth Vader. It would have felt hypocritical, and Jerry leaned into it. Oh, he leaned in hard. He'd wave to kids with that slow, villainous hand motion, the one that looks like he's choking someone with the force, and the kids would fall down, dramatically, giggling, clutching their throats like they'd been defeated. And then Jerry would go right back to mowing, the steady whir of the machine underscoring the whole production like background music. I don't know how his wife felt about it because she never came out during these shows. Though once I swear I heard her shouting from the garage something about him needing to take the helmet off before he got heat stroke. But Jerry just kept pushing that mower like the fate of the galaxy depended on it. There were theories, of course, because people always make up theories when they don't understand something. And in our neighborhood, it became something of a mystery to solve. Was he a Star Wars superfan? Maybe, but he never mentioned it otherwise. No memorabilia, no bumper stickers, not even a Yoda garden gnome? Was it a protest? Against what, the Homeowners Association? That would have made sense, but Jerry actually was the HOA president, so unless it was some elaborate act of rebellion against himself, that didn't check out. My personal theory was that Jerry had just decided, one random Saturday, that mowing the lawn was a soul-crushingly boring task, and instead of spiraling into despair, he chose chaos. And once you commit to mowing your lawn in a Darth Vader costume, you can never really go back to khaki shorts and a baseball cap. It's too anticlimactic. The best part, though, was when the mailman got involved. Our mailman, bless his soul, had seen everything from raccoons chasing him down the block to a goat someone briefly kept in their backyard, but Jerry broke him, and I mean broke him in the best way. Because one morning I looked outside and saw the mailman drop off the letters, glance over at Jerry's yard, and then pull out a pair of Yoda ears from his satchel, like he'd been waiting his whole career for this moment. From then on, whenever Jerry was mowing, the mailman would deliver the mail in full Yoda mode, muttering things like, "Cut the grass you must, and strong with the mower you are." And the entire block practically collapsed in laughter. Now, of course, not everyone was a fan. There's always at least one person who insists fun is illegal. And in our case, it was Mrs. Thompson from across the street. The same woman who once filed an official noise complaint because a toddler's birthday party had too many bubbles. She marched over one Saturday, wagging her finger like a cartoon villain herself, and demanded Jerry take off the costume, insisting it was unnerving to the community. Jerry, in full Darth Vader voice, calmly replied, "I find your lack of faith disturbing," and then turned back to his mower, and I swear I saw Mrs. Thompson's soul leave her body in that moment. After that, she never said another word about it, though she did upgrade her blinds to the kind that close tighter, so maybe that was her form of protest. What eventually ended the Vader mowing saga wasn't the HOA, wasn't complaints, wasn't even heat stroke. It was winter. Because once the snow came down and the grass disappeared, Jerry packed up the mower and the costume, and for a few long months we had to make do with normalcy again, which felt almost depressing after the space opera summer we'd all lived through. We missed it. The whole block missed it. And I think Jerry knew that because the very first warm day of spring, when the grass poked through again, there he was, cape fluttering, helmet gleaming, mower roaring back to life like the Death Star had been rebuilt. And the entire street came out to watch like it was the season premiere of our favorite show. And here's the thing, years later I moved away. New job, new city. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about Jerry, still out there somewhere, mowing his lawn in a Darth Vader suit, probably with new recruits like Boba Fett or Kylo Ren helping him edge the sidewalks, and I smile. Because some neighbors bring cookies, some neighbors bring drama, but Jerry brought us something better. The reminder that even in the most mundane parts of life, like mowing your lawn, you can choose to be unforgettable, and you can choose to make your neighbors laugh until they nearly choke on their iced tea. And honestly, isn't that the kind of energy we all need? The wedding, where the officiant fainted and the bride's grandma stepped in. So picture this, a sunny afternoon, a little too sunny in fact, one of those days where the weather feels like it's actively trying to remind you that deodorant was invented for a reason, and there we all were, sitting in neat rows of folding chairs under a big white canopy, waiting for my cousin's wedding to start, fanning ourselves with the printed programs that had already wilted into sad little paper pancakes. And everything looked perfect, like something out of a bridal magazine, except for the fact that none of us realized the efficient, poor man had not eaten breakfast and apparently had the hydration habits of a cactus. He started strong, I'll give him that. Booming voice, a couple of jokes about love being patient, and love being about deciding who gets control of the thermostat. Everyone chuckled. The bride beamed. The groom wiped a tear, and then, suddenly, mid-sentence, the man just wobbled like one of those inflatable tube guys outside a car dealership, and then went down flat. Microphone clattering, everyone gasping in unison like it was a scripted part of the ceremony, except it very much wasn't. For a few seconds, the crowd froze like we were all waiting for someone else to take charge, until the bride's grandmother, 85 years old and wearing orthopedic shoes and a floral dress with more personality than most people at that wedding, suddenly stood up, marched forward, and announced in a voice that carried like she'd been preparing her whole life for this moment. "Well, I suppose I'll have to finish this. Myself." Now, you need to understand, Grandma had zero credentials for this, unless you count watching reruns of soap operas as a form of religious training. But in that moment, she radiated authority, like some combination of Yoda, Judge Judy, and a very determined substitute teacher, and nobody dared to argue. The groom whispered something about legality, but Grandma waved her hand like a Jedi dismissing nonsense and said, "Legal, Schmigel, love is love. Now hold hands and don't look so pale. You're supposed to be happy." And so they did, because what else could they do? And the next 10 minutes turned into the most unorthodox, unforgettable wedding vows any of us had ever heard. Instead of quoting Corinthians or the Song of Solomon, Grandma launched into advice that sounded like a mixture of fortune, cookie wisdom, and scathing marital reality. Things like, if you argue, don't slam the doors, you'll break the hinges, and nobody likes paying for hinges. Or, never let him near the checkbook, men always buy ridiculous things like boats or 10 pounds of beef jerky. The bride was laughing so hard she smudged her mascara. The groom looked like he'd just been drafted into the army, and the rest of us were hanging on every word, wondering what wild truth bomb she was going to drop next. At one point, she stopped mid-sentence, squinted at the groom, and asked, "Do you know how to cook anything besides scrambled eggs?" And when he admitted he did not, she declared, "Then you'd better learn lasagna. It'll save your marriage." And I swear, the crowd applauded like she'd just solved world hunger. By the time she got to the "do you take this person" part, she'd abandoned the script entirely, improvising something along the lines of, "Do you swear to take this lovely girl and not drive her insane with your nonsense?" And he said yes, and then she turned to the bride and said, "Do you promise to tolerate his snoring, his bad jokes, and his mother who still thinks he's 12?" And the bride also said yes, though she side-eyed her new mother-in-law while doing it, which was maybe the bravest thing I've ever seen. And then Grandma, without hesitation, slapped the groom on the shoulder and declared, "Good, you're married. Now kiss her before I faint too." And that was it. Ceremony complete. The audience on its feet cheering, and the fainted officiant still lying gently shaded under a beach umbrella someone had dragged over him. Of course, the reception turned into absolute chaos, because how do you follow that act? The DJ played "Another One Bites the Dust" while Grandma hit the dance floor, cane in hand like a lightsaber, and the best man gave a speech that was essentially just 10 minutes of him trying to top Grandma's performance and failing miserably. Later, when the ambulance finally came to check on the officiant, he was fine. Dehydrated, but fine. Though I think his pride was bruised. More than anything else, because every time someone asked about the wedding, nobody mentioned him. They only said, "Oh my gosh, did you hear about how the bride's grandma saved the day?" And years later, when people bring it up, they don't even call it "my cousin's wedding." They just call it "the wedding," where the officiant fainted and grandma took over. Like it was less a ceremony and more a legendary episode of some long-running sitcom. The marriage itself? Still going strong, by the way, and every anniversary the bride's grandma calls them and asks, "Are you keeping the hinges intact?" And they laugh and say yes, and somehow it feels like the most binding vow of all. The coworker who faked an accent for 3 months. So I once had this coworker, let's call him Dan, though honestly, if he ever reads this, he'll know exactly who he is. And Dan started at our office one random Tuesday with the thickest British accent you've ever heard, like BBC documentary meets Shakespearean theater. And everyone was instantly charmed, because who doesn't love a British accent in a sea of Midwestern monotones, right? He'd stroll into meetings saying things like, "Right then, shall we crack on?" and "Fancy a cuppa?" And we all just nodded along, slightly dazzled, thinking we were in the presence of someone who probably had tea with the Queen at some point. The thing is, Dan wasn't British. Not even a little bit. He was from Ohio, and the only reason we know this is because one day, 3 months into his new job, his mom called the office landline, which nobody ever uses, and left a voicemail saying, "Hi, honey, it's your mom. Just checking if you want pot roast tonight. Call me back." And not only was her voice the most Ohio mom voice you could imagine, but she said his name in that drawn-out Midwestern way, "Daniel." And suddenly the entire office was like, wait a second. At first we thought maybe we'd misheard. Maybe he was raised in Ohio but moved to London as a kid, one of those complicated backstories that justify everything. But no, we confronted him gently. Well, as gently as you can when your entire sense of reality has just been shaken. And he crumbled immediately. He admitted in the most American voice possible that he had started doing the accent as a joke during his interview because he thought it made him sound more sophisticated, and then he got the job, and then it just kind of stuck. He said he tried to stop after the first week, but by then everyone already believed it, and he was too embarrassed to admit he'd been faking it. So he kept going, day after day, sipping tea in the break room like he was auditioning for Downton Abbey, all while knowing he'd dug himself into a hole deeper than the London Underground. The office didn't know how to react at first. Half of us were furious because we'd spent months asking him about life back home, and he'd just made up entire stories like the time he supposedly rode the tube every day or how he missed a proper English curry. The other half of us thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened in corporate history. HR didn't even have a rulebook for this scenario, like, what do you file that under? Fraud? Identity theft? Improper use of the Queen's English? Ultimately, nothing happened except that Dan had to sheepishly reintroduce himself in his real voice during the Monday meeting, and hearing him say, "Hi, I'm Dan from Ohio," in the flattest American accent imaginable was like watching a magician reveal all his tricks at once. But here's the kicker. Even after the truth came out, some people said they missed British Dan. Meetings felt duller without his brilliant ideas and spot of bother quips. One guy from accounting even asked him to just do the accent sometimes for morale, and Dan, bless his chaotic heart, agreed. So now he's a part-time Brit, slipping back into character whenever the office feels gloomy, and somehow that's just become normal. Like, oh yeah, that's Dan. He's from Ohio, but also kind of from London when the vibes call for it. And honestly, I think it taught all of us an important lesson. Never underestimate the lengths people will go to make an interview memorable, and never trust a man who insists on calling potato chips crisps without at least meeting his mom first. The Airbnb with thin walls that revealed way too much. So I once stayed in this Airbnb that looked perfect on the listing. Glossy photos, cozy furniture, five-star reviews. The kind of place that makes you think, ah yes, I will drink coffee here and become a new person. Maybe write a novel, maybe find inner peace. But in reality, the moment I stepped inside, I realized the one thing the host forgot to mention. The walls were approximately the thickness of a paper napkin. I don't mean they were just thin. I mean they were so thin I could hear the neighbor's phone notifications vibrating like they were inside my own pocket. I could hear someone sneeze 3 rooms away, and I knew instantly this was going to be a very different kind of stay. The first night, I discovered exactly how bad it was because I was lying there trying to drift off, feeling fancy in the luxury linens that were clearly just Target sheets rebranded with confidence, when suddenly I heard every single word of the couple next door arguing about whether or not quinoa counts as a carb. It was passionate, it was dramatic, it was educational, and it ended with someone slamming what I assume was a wooden spoon against a counter and declaring they were done with health food forever. I thought, okay, fine, people argue, no big deal. But then the next night it escalated. I just finished brushing my teeth when I heard what I can only describe as a live broadcast of their reconciliation. The kind of reconciliation that involves giggles, squeaky furniture, and the unmistakable rhythm of bed springs announcing to the world that love had triumphed after all. I lay there, toothbrush still in hand, listening like an unwilling guest at a very private concert, wondering if I should clap when it was over. By the third night, I'd given up all pretense of privacy and just leaned into it. I brewed tea, settled in bed, and listened to my nightly soap opera, because the walls didn't just let sound through, they practically amplified it, and at this point I knew more about these strangers than I did about some of my closest friends. I knew one of them hated cilantro, I knew one of them cried during commercials with puppies, I knew one of them snored like a motorcycle starting up. I also knew they really liked to reconcile. A lot. Loudly. With an enthusiasm that suggested either deep passion or a competition to see how many times they could make the headboard smack the wall before someone complained. The funniest part was that I wasn't the only one suffering or maybe enjoying this audio experience. One morning while I was making coffee in the shared kitchen, another guest walked in, raised their eyebrows, and simply said, "So, you hear them too?" And we both burst out laughing because yes, we did. Every single night like clockwork. Eventually, I left a polite review that mentioned the paper-thin walls without being too explicit, though judging by the smirk on the host's face when I checked out, I think they knew exactly what kind of entertainment their Airbnb provided. And now, whenever someone mentions booking an Airbnb, I don't think of charming lofts or rustic cabins. I think of that one week where I accidentally lived in surround sound, where romance, arguments, and questionable cooking choices bled through the walls like I was trapped inside a reality TV show I never signed up for. And honestly, I kind of miss it, because my apartment walls are too thick, and sometimes silence can feel lonelier than overhearing someone else loudly debate the carb content of quinoa at midnight. The bachelor party that accidentally booked the wrong hotel room. So this story starts with my friend's bachelor party, which was supposed to be a weekend of classy chaos, the kind of trip where everyone swears they'll be responsible, but you know at least one person is going to end up losing a shoe and possibly a small portion of their dignity. We all chipped in to book a big hotel suite, one of those sprawling ones with a kitchenette, a massive couch, and enough space for 12 guys to convince themselves they were sophisticated while drinking cheap beer out of red cups. Everything seemed fine. Confirmation email, reservation under the best man's name, the works. Except when we arrived, slightly buzzed already because someone thought it would be funny to pregame in the Uber, the hotel receptionist looked confused and said, "Oh, you're in 1702." Now we marched up to 1702, swiped the yes key card, and walked into what was absolutely not a bachelor party suite. Instead, it was a honeymoon suite. Heart-shaped bed, rose petals scattered like we'd just interrupted a Nicholas Sparks movie, champagne chilling in an ice bucket, and a gigantic mirror positioned in a way that left very little to the imagination. Naturally, instead of realizing this was a mistake, we assumed this was just the hotel's idea of humor. So, we did what any group of groomsmen would do. We made ourselves at home. The groom sat on the heart-shaped bed like some kind of reluctant Cupid. We popped the champagne, and within 20 minutes someone had eaten half the chocolate-covered strawberries, while another guy was trying to wear the satin robe provided for the lady of the suite. The problem arose when, about an hour later, the actual honeymoon couple showed up. Imagine coming back from a romantic dinner hand in hand, ready to continue your wedded bliss, only to open the door and find 12 half-drunk men singing karaoke into hairbrushes while your strawberries have been eaten and your robe is stretched beyond recognition. The bride screamed. The groom looked like he was ready to swing, and we all froze like guilty raccoons caught rifling through the garbage. Turns out, the hotel staff had mixed up the reservations, ours and theirs, two very different kinds of celebrations, but with oddly similar last names. Security showed up, everyone tried to explain at once, and eventually the bride, to her credit, started laughing because honestly, how could you not? Meanwhile, the best man was begging the honeymoon couple not to press charges while also holding half a strawberry in his hand, like incriminating evidence. The hotel upgraded us to the actual suite we had booked, but only after we promised to replace the champagne and the chocolates, which of course we did, though we couldn't do much about the robe, which now looked like it had been through a frat initiation. The rest of the weekend went fine. Well, as fine as bachelor parties ever go. But the highlight of the trip wasn't the bars or the stories we planned. It was the legend of how we crashed a honeymoon by accident. To this day, whenever anyone brings up that wedding, nobody talks about the ceremony or the vows or the first dance. They say, "Remember when 12 idiots in Hawaiian shirts hijacked a honeymoon suite?" And everyone nods because yes, that was the moment that truly defined the marriage. The couple even sent us a Christmas card the next year with a note that said, "Hope you found your own strawberries," which I think was their polite way of saying, "Please never cross our path again." The stranger on a train who told me a secret, too steamy to repeat. So there I was, sitting on a long-distance train ride, the kind that promises a quiet journey with maybe some scenic fields and a vending machine. Coffee that tastes vaguely like sadness, when suddenly fate decided I would not be. Getting a peaceful ride, but rather a front-row ticket to someone else's life unraveling in real time. The train was mostly empty except for this man who plopped down across from me, uninvited but determined, carrying an aura that screamed, "I have something to confess, and you, random stranger, are going to hear it." At first, he just made small talk, where I was headed, whether I liked train travel, a comment about how the seats smelled faintly of old sandwiches, and I nodded politely, hoping he'd get bored. But no. Within 10 minutes, he leaned closer, lowered his voice in the kind of dramatic whisper that makes you instinctively lean in and said, "I need to tell someone a secret, and you'll never see me again, so it might as well be you." Now, there are two options in this situation. Politely excuse yourself and spend the rest of the ride in the bathroom pretending to have food poisoning, or buckle up and listen, because when the universe hands you a live episode of a soap opera, you don't walk away. So I listened. And, oh, did he deliver? The story he told was so scandalous, so dripping with drama, that if I repeated it word for word, half of you would accuse me of making it up. It involved an office romance that spiraled out of control, a secret rendezvous in the most unlikely of places, and a tangled web of lies that could have fueled 3 seasons of a Netflix series. He spoke with the intensity of a man narrating his own downfall, occasionally pausing to sip water like he was a weary actor in a monologue, while I sat there wide-eyed, nodding like I was his therapist, though I was really just a random person in sweatpants who had planned to read a novel about gardening tips. Every detail got spicier, every twist more absurd, and the train rattling along the tracks only made it feel like we were barreling towards some inevitable crash. At one point, he even asked me for advice, like, what should he do now? And I thought, sir, I barely know what to do with my laundry. I am not qualified for this level of moral decision making. Still, I muttered something vague about honesty being the best policy, which is the safest advice you can give without accidentally blowing up someone's life. And he nodded like I had just handed him the wisdom of the ages. When my stop finally came, he smiled, thanked me for listening, and said, "You've just saved me," which was unsettling because I had done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the right time. He got off at the next stop, vanished into the crowd, and I sat there wondering if I'd just hallucinated the whole thing. To this day, I've never told anyone the full story because, frankly, it's too wild, too messy, and far too steamy to ever be repeated without consequences. But sometimes, late at night, I think about him and wonder if he ever sorted out his tangled life, or if he's still somewhere out there, boarding another train, whispering another confession to some other poor soul who just wanted to drink vending machine coffee in peace. A family reunion where someone brought their secret partner. So family reunions are already chaotic enough, right? You've got name tags that never stick, potato salad that looks suspiciously warm, and distant relatives you only recognize from embarrassing Christmas cards. But at this particular reunion, chaos got promoted to full-blown drama when one of my cousins decided to bring along a partner that, let's just say, wasn't exactly on the guest list, or even public knowledge. We were all gathered in the park under one of those rented pavilions with squeaky picnic tables, kids running around with juice boxes, uncles setting up folding chairs like they were building a fortress when my cousin strolled in hand with a person none of us had ever met before, looking confident, looking radiant, and completely unaware that within about 5 minutes, half the family was going to need smelling salts. At first, everyone assumed this was just a new boyfriend, no big deal. Families grow, people bring dates, but then the whispers started. I overheard an aunt mutter, "Isn't she still with Mark?" And another aunt hiss back, "Apparently not." And suddenly the reunion turned into a live-action soap opera where the potato salad was just a prop. Now the best part was how it unfolded in real time, because Mark, the supposedly current boyfriend, was very much still in the picture, at least according to Facebook, where he had posted a gushing, "Can't wait to see you tonight, babe," just the night before. And here was my cousin, holding hands with someone who was most definitely not Mark, introducing them as Jamie with the casual ease of someone announcing they'd brought a new dip for the chips. The room, or rather the pavilion, went quiet in that way where everyone is pretending to still chew their food, but really they're just waiting for someone to say something explosive. And leave it to Grandma, sweet, sharp Grandma, who's never let a family secret stay secret for more than 3 minutes to break the silence. She squinted over her glasses, fork in hand, and asked in the loudest possible voice, "Honey, where's Mark?" And the collective gasp could have powered a wind turbine. My cousin froze. Jamie froze. The kids stopped chasing each other mid-run, and even the squirrels seemed to pause like they wanted to hear the answer. After a beat too long, my cousin plastered on the brightest smile and said, "Oh, Mark couldn't make it," which might have worked if she hadn't been gripping Jamie's hand like a contestant on Survivor clinging to immunity. Grandma, bless her relentless curiosity, pressed on, "Well then, who's this young person?" And before my cousin could answer, Jamie, perhaps thinking honesty was the best policy, cheerfully announced, "I'm the reason she dumped Mark." And I swear to you, time slowed down like a movie. The aunts clutched their pearls, the uncles all pretended to suddenly be very invested in arranging condiments, and the teenagers whipped out their phones because they knew this was the family lore that would live on for decades. The next 30 minutes were pure theater. My cousin tried to do damage control, explaining that she and Mark had technically broken up 2 weeks ago, though the Facebook evidence suggested otherwise. And Jamie seemed blissfully unaware that they were walking straight into a minefield of small-town family politics. Mark himself didn't show up, thank goodness, but every conversation after that started with a hushed, "Did you hear?" and ended with someone dramatically spooning more baked beans onto their plate like they needed carbs to process the scandal. At one point, Uncle Dave tried to lighten the mood by starting a beanbag toss game, but when someone shouted, "Don't let Jamie play, they've already stolen enough hearts," it was all over. The entire pavilion burst out laughing, even Grandma, and the tension broke. By dessert, everyone had more or less accepted Jamie into the fold, mostly because they brought an amazing homemade peach cobbler that smoothed over a lot of hard feelings, but the reunion was forever rebranded. No one remembered the potato salad. No one cared about the raffle for the world's ugliest quilt. No one talked about Cousin Jeff's new job in IT. All anyone remembered was the family reunion where someone brought their secret partner, the day when gossip flowed faster than the lemonade, and when Grandma's innocent questions nearly caused a public implosion. And now, years later, every time we gather, someone inevitably asks, "So, is Jamie coming?" With a grin. And my cousin rolls her eyes, but she always smiles too, because deep down, I think she knows she gave us the greatest family reunion gift of all. A story that will outlive us all, retold around picnic tables long after the cobbler is gone. The bride who kissed the best man during the toast. So let me set the scene. A wedding reception? The kind where the lights are strung up like fireflies. The tables are covered with linen so white you're afraid to spill anything on them. And the DJ is already spinning a questionable mix of pop songs from 2008, and everyone is halfway through their second glass of champagne. The kind of atmosphere where people are buzzing with joy and just tipsy enough to forget that somebody's uncle is definitely going to request Sweet Caroline before the night is over. The ceremony had been beautiful, picture perfect. The bride walking down the aisle glowing like she'd been dipped in sunshine. The groom tearing up so hard someone had to hand him tissues. The vows sweet enough to give everyone a cavity, and then came the reception, where the real chaos always brews. Dinner was served, the chicken was decent, the salmon was questionable, the bread rolls were devoured as though none of us had eaten in years. And soon enough it was time for the speeches, the moment where you brace yourself because you know someone's either going to cry or say something wildly inappropriate, and sometimes both at once. The maid of honor went first. A lovely speech filled with anecdotes about the bride stealing her clothes in college and their late-night heart-to-hearts. And it was sweet, wholesome, maybe a little long, but forgivable, and everyone applauded politely. Then came the best man. Now, this is where things took a sharp left turn into territory no wedding etiquette book has ever dared to cover. The best man, tall, handsome, the kind of guy who always seems like he should be in a commercial for watches, grabbed the microphone with a confidence that suggested he'd been rehearsing in front of a mirror all week. He started off with the usual jokes, roasting the groom for his video game addiction, poking fun at the time he tried to cook pasta without water, and everyone laughed, the room buzzing with that warm communal joy that comes from shared history. But then, as if possessed by some chaotic spirit, he shifted gears, his tone softening, his eyes locking onto the bride, and he launched into a heartfelt ode that seemed a little too heartfelt. He talked about how radiant she looked, how she had always been the most graceful person in any room, how he had admired her for years, and the laughter slowly died down, replaced by an uncomfortable hush as people began side-eyeing each other like, "Wait, is this normal?" The groom chuckled nervously, assuming maybe this was just the best man being poetic, but then came the moment, the unforgettable, irreversible moment. The best man raised his glass, looked straight at the bride with the intensity of a man making a declaration to the universe, and as the room held its collective breath, he stepped forward, leaned down, and kissed her. Not a polite peck on the cheek, not a clumsy brush, but a real kiss, the kind you'd expect at the end of a rom-com when the credits are about to roll. The room exploded. Gasps, shrieks, a champagne flute hitting the floor, someone's great aunt whispering, "Oh my heavens," like she was auditioning for a Victorian drama. The DJ, bless his oblivious soul, chose that exact moment to crank up a Bruno Mars song, and the chaos was set to a jaunty beat. The bride froze, eyes wide, cheeks flushed, clearly caught between shock and the horrifying realization that her entire extended family had just witnessed the scandal. The groom, meanwhile, stood there with the expression of a man whose brain had temporarily blue-screened, like he was trying to process whether this was some elaborate prank or if he had just been publicly humiliated on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. The best man, realizing perhaps 2 seconds too late that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment, stammered something into the microphone about just being overcome with emotion before abandoning the mic stand altogether and retreating toward the open bar like it was a foxhole. What followed was pure pandemonium. Half the room erupted into whispers, the other half into nervous laughter, and Grandma, yes, Grandma again, because every good story needs a grandma, shouted, "Well, I never!" so loudly the DJ had to turn the volume down. The bride tried to smooth things over, insisting to the groom that it was nothing, that it was just a surprise while the groom's face cycled through every known shade of red. The groomsmen scrambled to corral the best man, who by now was double-fisting whiskey sours like he was trying to forget the last 10 minutes of his life, and the bridesmaids surrounded the bride, fanning her with napkins and whispering furiously. The photographer, of course, caught the entire thing, immortalizing the kiss in a series of high-definition photos that would later become both legend and blackmail material. Dinner had ended, but the night was far from over. Some people tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, hitting the dance floor, doing the cha-cha slide with forced smiles, but you could feel the tension in the air, thick as the buttercream frosting on the untouched wedding cake. Every conversation at the tables was about the kiss. The cousins speculated whether the bride had secretly harbored feelings for the best man all along. The aunts debated whether annulments were easier than divorces, and one particularly drunk uncle kept saying, "Man, I wish someone kissed me like that at my wedding." The groom eventually pulled the best man outside for what looked like a very intense, possibly threatening conversation, though thankfully no punches were thrown. When they returned, the groom's tie was loosened, the best man's shirt was untucked, and both looked like they'd aged 10 years. The bride soldiered on, dancing with relatives, smiling through clenched teeth, but everyone could see the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. At one point, she grabbed the mic herself, announcing in a voice as sweet as poison, "Let's remember why we're here tonight, to celebrate love and commitment." And the word commitment had never sounded so much like a dagger. Still, as the night wore on and the drinks flowed, the mood lightened slightly. People got too drunk to care, the cake was finally cut, and the dance floor filled with sweaty relatives convinced they were auditioning for Dancing with the Stars. But the story of the night had already been sealed. When the reception ended and everyone stumbled back to their hotel rooms, the gossip began its second life, spreading faster than the flu. By breakfast the next morning, it had reached epic proportions. Some claimed the bride kissed him back, others swore she slapped him immediately after, and one dramatic cousin insisted the groom had stormed out entirely, though in reality he was just sulking by the dessert table. The truth, as always, was somewhere in the middle, but it didn't matter because weddings are less about reality and more about the stories people tell afterward, and this story had more legs than a centipede. Years later, nobody remembers the vows. Nobody remembers the first dance song. Nobody even remembers what the groom's cake looked like. But everyone remembers the toast, the kiss, the collective gasp, and the way the bride's grandmother nearly fainted into the potato salad. Whenever the family gets together, someone inevitably says, "Hey, remember that wedding?" And everyone nods because, yes, we all remember the wedding, where the bride kissed the best man during the toast. The night love, loyalty, and champagne collided in spectacular fashion, and a best man's speech went down in history as the boldest and dumbest move anyone had ever witnessed under twinkle lights and Tool. And maybe, just maybe, the moral of the story is simple. At weddings, keep your toast heartfelt, keep your champagne in check, and for the love of everything sacred, keep your lips to yourself. The night my boss ended up in the same hot tub as me. So this happened on a work retreat, one of those corporate bonding weekends that promise team building, but really just mean awkward icebreakers, forced trust exercises, and way too much coffee served out of urns that look like they haven't been cleaned since the Cold War. Our company had rented out this rustic lodge in the mountains, complete with fireplaces, squeaky bunk beds, and a hot tub that had clearly seen better days, but still managed to lure in every exhausted employee after hours like moths to a jacuzzi-flavored flame. The first night went fine. We did the obligatory scavenger hunt, ate way too many lukewarm s'mores, and sat through a motivational speech that included more pie charts than actual motivation. But by the second night, everyone just wanted to relax. So naturally, the hot tub became the crown jewel of the evening. Now, here's where things went sideways because I thought I was being clever, sneaking out early before the rest of my colleagues so I could have the hot tub to myself. A little moment of peace away from small talk about quarterly projections and Janet from accounting's obsession with scented candles. I slipped into the water, sank down until the bubbles were practically massaging my soul, and closed my eyes like some sort of spa commercial. 5 minutes later, just as I was starting to debate whether staying in there for 2 hours would give me permanent prune fingers, I heard footsteps on the deck. I opened my eyes, and there he was, my boss. Not just any boss, mind you, but the big boss, the guy who signs paychecks and terrifies interns, standing there in swim trunks that screamed, "I haven't been shopping since 1998. We locked eyes, and there was this moment of mutual horror, like neither of us had emotionally prepared to see the other half naked in bubbling water after dark. He gave this awkward little nod, the kind people give when they're pretending everything's fine, and without a word, he stepped in. And just like that, I was sharing a hot tub with my boss. No escape, no excuses, just me, him, and the sound of jets gurgling like 1,000 tiny, judgmental voices. At first, we sat in silence, both pretending to be deeply fascinated by the stars overhead, though, of course, the only thing I could think about was whether it was appropriate to make small talk in a hot tub with a man who controlled my career. Eventually, he broke the silence by saying, "So, how's the project coming along?" And I nearly drowned, because the last thing I wanted to discuss while half-boiled in chlorine soup was spreadsheets. I mumbled something about steady progress and tried to steer the conversation toward neutral territory, like the weather or how suspiciously squeaky the bunk beds were. But he kept circling back to work, asking about deadlines and deliverables, and all I could think was, is this what counts as professional development now? Half an hour into the world's weirdest performance review, he finally relaxed a little, leaning back with his arms spread across the edge of the tub, like he was the king of awkward situations, and that's when things got truly bizarre. He sighed and said, I never get time like this to just breathe. And suddenly I was his therapist, nodding along as he confessed how stressed he was, how he worried about layoffs, how he sometimes wondered if he was even good at his job. Meanwhile, I was trying to maintain eye contact without looking at the fact that we were both sitting in a bubbling pot of human soup. Just when I thought it couldn't get any stranger, 2 more coworkers wandered in, clearly tipsy from the networking cocktails downstairs, and froze when they saw us. One of them whispered, "Is this allowed?" And the other just shrugged before cannonballing in, splashing both me and my boss with enough water to make the situation feel like a baptism. Suddenly, the tub was full, everyone laughing nervously, and my boss, to his credit, loosened up completely, cracking jokes, splashing back, and even leading a rousing debate about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. It was surreal. This man who usually barked orders at meetings was now giggling like a teenager in a hot tub, while I sat there wondering if HR would ever believe me if I wrote this down in a report. Eventually, the night wound down, people drifted off to bed, and I was left alone with my boss again. He gave me a pat on the shoulder, said, "You're doing good work," and climbed out, dripping water all over the deck like a departing sea monster. I sat there alone, half convinced I'd hallucinated the whole thing, until I noticed his towel still sitting on the bench, forgotten in the chaos. The next morning at breakfast, he walked in wearing the same expressionless face he always wore, like the previous night had been erased from his memory. Nobody mentioned the hot tub, not even the coworkers who had witnessed it, as though we'd all silently agreed this was a secret best buried beneath layers of chlorine and denial. To this day, whenever I hear the phrase team building, I think about that hot tub, about sitting elbow to elbow with my boss while trying not to discuss quarterly earnings. And I realize some professional boundaries can never be fully restored once you've shared bubbling water under the stars. And maybe that's okay. Maybe sometimes the universe throws you into absurd situations to remind you that even bosses are just people. Awkward, half-naked people who sometimes forget their towels. The stranger on a train who told me a secret, too steamy to repeat. So picture me sitting there on a long train ride, earbuds in, pretending to read a book while actually just watching the scenery blur by when this man sits across from me. The kind of man who has the restless energy of someone about to either sell you a timeshare or confess a lifelong secret. And before I can even offer a polite nod, he leans in and says, "You look like someone I can trust." Now, that is never the right thing to hear from a stranger on public transport. But the problem with trains is you can't exactly leave at the next block. You're stuck until the next station, so I smiled, nodded, and braced myself for whatever bizarre confession was about to unfold. And oh, did he deliver. He launched into a story that began innocently enough. Something about how life had been stressful, work wasn't going great, relationships complicated, the kind of conversation you'd expect from an oversharey seatmate. But then the details started piling on, and suddenly I was the unwilling therapist in what felt like a live recording of the world's most scandalous podcast. He confessed to an office romance, one that had spiraled into a hidden affair, one that involved secret hotel rooms, elaborate lies, and a tangled mess of feelings that sounded like it could fuel 3 entire seasons of a soap opera. The more he spoke, the more animated he became, hands waving, voice dropping to a whisper whenever he thought someone else on the train might overhear. Though, honestly, the only people nearby had fallen asleep, leaving me as the sole audience member in his one-man show. At some point, he even asked me what I thought he should do, as if I, a random person eating a squashed granola bar, had the wisdom to untangle his disaster of a love life. I muttered something vague about honesty being important, which he took as sage advice, nodding solemnly as if I'd just handed him the key to enlightenment. By the time my stop came, I felt like I had aged 10 years, carrying the weight of a secret that was far too steamy, too messy, and too complicated to repeat. He thanked me, called me a lifesaver, and disappeared into the crowd at the next station, leaving me, sitting there wondering if I had just hallucinated the whole thing, or if I'd accidentally become a character in someone else's drama. And to this day, whenever I board a train, I keep my headphones in and my eyes glued to the window. Because you never know when a stranger might decide you're the perfect candidate to bear the kind of secret it's better left between them and their questionable life choices. The summer camp crush. That came back. Years later, married to my cousin. So here's the story, and I swear to you it sounds like the plot of a slightly unbelievable rom-com. But it happened. And it still makes me laugh and cringe in equal measure whenever family gatherings roll around. Years ago, back when braces and bug spray were my entire personality, I went to this summer camp tucked away in the woods, the kind with wooden cabins, counselors who looked way too young to be in charge of actual children, and a schedule packed with activities like canoeing, arts and crafts, and pretending the cafeteria food wasn't just mystery meat in disguise. And that's where I met her, my first official crush. She was in my group, tall, confident, with the kind of smile that made me forget how to speak in complete sentences. And to my teenage brain, she might as well have been a movie star. We hung out by the campfire, roasted marshmallows that were always burned on the outside and raw on the inside. And one night during flashlight tag, she grabbed my hand so we wouldn't get caught. And I swear my heart nearly exploded like a microwaved marshmallow. To me, she was unforgettable. To her, well, I was probably just that kid who tripped during canoe practice and nearly drowned us both, but hey, it was something. Camp ended. We exchanged those heartfelt promises kids always make, like, we'll write letters every week, and we'll totally stay best friends forever. And of course, within a month, the letters stopped. The school year swallowed us whole, and the crush faded into one of those nostalgic memories you bring up when someone asks about embarrassing teenage moments. Fast forward 15 years. Life had moved on. I'd survived high school, college, a string of questionable jobs, and now I was heading to a family reunion. The kind where you brace yourself for potato salad that's been left out a little too long, and relatives asking when you're finally getting married. I arrived late, juggling a casserole I'd promised to bring, only to walk into the backyard and freeze because there she was. My camp crush. Older, of course, but still instantly recognizable, still with that same smile that turned my brain into mashed potatoes. And she was standing next to my cousin, holding his hand, wearing a ring. It took a full 30 seconds for my brain to process what I was seeing, and in that time, my aunt came over, cheerful as ever, and introduced her as my cousin's new wife. My cousin had gotten married a few months earlier in a small ceremony out of town, one I couldn't attend because of work, so this was my first time meeting her. Except I had already met her 15 years earlier at summer camp, where I had spent 2 weeks mooning over her while tripping over my shoelaces. My stomach did a full gymnastics routine. She smiled at me, clearly not recognizing me at all, and said, "Hi, nice to meet you." And I, in what might have been my most Oscar-worthy performance, smiled back and said, "Nice to meet you too." Like I hadn't once written her name in Sharpie on the inside of my camp notebook, surrounded by poorly drawn hearts. The rest of the day was surreal. I kept waiting for her to suddenly remember, to look at me and say, "Hey, weren't you that kid who almost tipped the canoe?" But it never came. She was polite, friendly, chatting about her job and how she and my cousin had met, which, by the way, was apparently at a trivia night at a local bar, not at summer camp years ago, because to her that camp was just a blip in the past, a footnote barely worth mentioning. Meanwhile, I was sitting there at the picnic table, sipping lemonade like it was moonshine, trying not to laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. My cousin, completely oblivious, kept bragging about how lucky he was to have found her, and I couldn't disagree. She was still wonderful. But now she was family. And suddenly my childhood crush was my cousin's wife, which is the kind of twist you don't see coming unless you live in a soap opera. Of course, family reunions thrive on gossip, and it only took one cousin to notice the strange look on my face before the whispers began. "Why do you look weird?" they asked, and I shrugged. But eventually someone pried it out of me, and within an hour, half the family knew I'd once had a crush on the new addition. The teasing was relentless. "Hey, remember when you almost drowned your future cousin-in-law at camp? Didn't you once write her name all over your notebook?" Every joke was louder than the last, and I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole. My cousin, bless his heart, found the whole thing hilarious. He'd laughed so hard he nearly choked on a chicken wing, and from that day on, he has never let me live it down. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every family barbecue, he manages to bring it up, grinning like the cat who got the cream, while I sit there rolling my eyes, pretending it's funny, but secretly wishing for selective amnesia. The kicker? She still doesn't remember me. Not once in all these years has she looked at me and said, "Hey, weren't you at that camp?" I suppose that's for the best, really, because how do you even explain that the shy, awkward kid you barely noticed back then turned out to be your husband's cousin? But sometimes, when we're all sitting around after dinner, swapping stories, and someone brings up summer camp experiences, I catch myself wondering if I should just tell her, if I should laugh and say, "Actually, we met a long time ago." But I never do. Some things are better left in the past, tucked away with burned marshmallows and squeaky bunk beds. Still, every once in a while, when my cousin nudges me at family events and whispers, "Hey, remember camp?" I just groan and tell him to shut up, because the universe clearly has a twisted sense of humor, and my only choice is to laugh along. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Sometimes your childhood crush doesn't become your soulmate. Sometimes she becomes your cousin's wife. And sometimes life hands you stories so absurd they're almost worth the embarrassment, just so you'll have something to laugh about around the campfire years later. The bachelorette party that accidentally booked a church hall. So this all started with what was supposed to be a glamorous, unforgettable bachelorette party. The kind of night where everyone gets dressed up in sparkly outfits, sips cocktails with names like Blushing Bride or Something Blue, and maybe ends up dancing barefoot at 2 in the morning while shouting song lyrics nobody fully remembers. The maid of honor, bless her ambitious heart, had taken full responsibility for planning the event. She was determined to make it legendary, a story the bride would one day tell her grandchildren with a mischievous grin. She scoured venues, made endless phone calls, and when she found what she thought was the perfect hall, great price, spacious, available on the exact weekend she needed, she jumped on it without hesitation. She put down the deposit, decorated the invitations with glittery fonts, and promised everyone a night to remember. And, oh, it was remembered, but not for the reasons she expected. The night arrived. Everyone gathered in the parking lot, already buzzing with excitement. Tiaras perched on heads, sashes draped across shoulders, reading things like Team Bride and Hot Mess Express. The bride was wearing a ridiculous veil covered in fake rhinestones, the kind that caught the light from the street lamps and made her look like a disco ball on legs. They were laughing, shouting, ready to party, when the maid of honor proudly led them to the grand double doors of the hall. She swung them open, expecting a blast of music and flashing lights. Instead, the sound that greeted them was the faint echo of a hymn. The sight that greeted them was even better. Rows of folding chairs neatly arranged, a wooden cross at the front, and a stack of hymnals on a table by the entrance. Because you see, she hadn't booked a nightclub or an event hall or even a banquet room. She had booked the fellowship hall of a church. There was a stunned silence. The bride blinked. Someone in the back giggled nervously. The maid of honor, horrified, checked the confirmation email on her phone and realized too late that the St. Michael's event hall she had booked was not some trendy new spot in the city, but the multi-purpose room of St. Michael's Lutheran Church. And the kicker? The church choir was still practicing in the adjoining room. You could hear them faintly warming up with amazing grace as 20 women in glitter dresses and stiletto heels stared at each other like they had just walked into the wrong dimension. At first, panic set in. The maid of honor begged everyone to give her 5 minutes to figure it out, while the bride, trying not to cry, muttered something about divine punishment. But then one of the bridesmaids, tipsy enough from pre-party champagne to see the humor, burst out laughing. "Well," she said, "God works in mysterious ways." That was all it took. The group collectively cracked, laughter rippling through the hall until even the bride was doubled over, tears streaming down her cheeks. And in that moment, they decided if the universe was going to give them a church hall for their bachelorette party, then by heaven, they were going to own it. They set up their decorations anyway, hanging pink streamers over the cross, taping paper cutouts of champagne glasses to the bulletin board, and placing a blow-up doll in the baptismal font. The maid of honor smuggled in a Bluetooth speaker, cranked up Beyoncé, and soon the church fellowship hall was transformed into the most unholy nightclub anyone had ever seen. They danced between folding chairs, clinked solo cups filled with cheap Prosecco, and shouted lyrics that echoed off the walls meant for Sunday school lessons. The bride herself, halfway between hysterics and euphoria, stood on the stage where sermons were usually delivered and belted out karaoke versions of 90s pop songs, her rhinestone veil glittering under the flickering fluorescent lights. But the true highlight came when the church choir, curious about the noise, peeked in. Imagine their faces when they saw a group of women in neon feather boas doing the Macarena in front of a crucifix. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that could have ended in scandal or disaster, but then, miracle of miracles, the choir director laughed. And soon enough, the choir joined in. They didn't drink, of course, but they clapped along, cheered for the bride, and even taught the group a gospel version of Girls Just Want to Have Fun that had everyone swaying with hands in the air like they were in the world's weirdest revival service. By the end of the night, the maid of honor had gone from mortified to legendary. The bride declared it the best bachelorette party ever, precisely because it was so ridiculous. No one else could say they had celebrated their impending marriage by twerking under a banner that read, "Welcome to Vacation Bible School." They took photos in front of the altar, posed with hymnals, and toasted with sparkling cider the choir ladies had offered from the church fridge. It was pure chaos wrapped in pure joy, the kind of night that could never be planned but would be remembered, forever. The next morning, blurry-eyed and hungover, the group sat around a diner table replaying every absurd detail. The maid of honor apologized again and again, but the bride kept assuring her it was perfect, that she wouldn't have wanted it any other way. And honestly, she meant it. Because while nightclub parties fade into a blur of flashing lights and sticky dance floors, the story of the bachelorette party that accidentally booked a church hall would live forever in family lore, retold at future weddings, at baby showers, even at Christmas dinners. Whenever someone mentioned planning a party, someone else would inevitably grin and say, just make sure you don't book a church hall this time. And maybe that's the moral of the story. Sometimes mistakes make the best memories, sometimes glitter belongs in a sanctuary, and sometimes the line between holy and hilarious is just a Bluetooth speaker away. The night my ex showed up at my honeymoon hotel. It was supposed to be the kind of week where time slows down and soft hotel robes somehow make you a better person, where room service feels like a love language, and the only truly difficult decision you face is whether to nap before the beach or after the beach. So imagine my mood when I walked into the lobby of our honeymoon hotel, hand in hand with my freshly minted spouse, all starry-eyed and sunscreened, only to hear a very familiar voice say my name. In that particular way, only someone from another chapter of your life can say it. Like they are knocking on a door you thought you'd locked forever. And there she was, my ex, incarnate, in a sundress and a pair of sunglasses perched on her head like punctuation, smiling like fate had a sense of humor and maybe a little too much time on its hands. For a few terrifying seconds, I was convinced I had hallucinated her, that the champagne at the reception had fermented my memories into ghosts, but no. She was real enough to cast a shadow on the marble floor, real enough to hand me a hug that smelled like coconut lotion and bad decisions, real enough to turn my new spouse into a statue whose eyes flicked between us like a very polite security camera, deciding if an incident report would be needed. She said it was a coincidence. Of course she did. What else can you say when you pop up at a honeymoon hotel looking like an unresolved plot twist? She was there with friends, last-minute trip, flights were cheap. The universe had apparently booked her into the exact same property where I was staying, and wasn't it wild how small the world is? And I nodded because nodding is the universal sign for I am too stunned to form any other response without combusting. My spouse squeezed my hand exactly once, which is marital code for we are going to talk about this the second we're alone. And the three of us made small talk in that brightly lit lobby while a pianist in the corner played a bossa nova cover of some pop song about heartbreak that felt like the hotel itself was trolling me. And then we escaped to the elevator with the kind of smile you wear when you are trying to be gracious about an asteroid headed toward your vacation. Upstairs, once the door clicked shut and the ocean became a postcard beyond the balcony, my spouse did the reasonable thing and asked for context, and I gave the abridged version. It had been a long time. It ended for a reason. She was a chapter we had both closed, and there was exactly zero chance this coincidence meant anything, except that the travel gods sometimes did improv comedy. And my spouse, to their eternal credit, took a breath, nodded, and suggested we proceed with our honeymoon like normal, which is a noble intention, until fate decides it is not done with you. Because that evening, after a day of swimming and pretending not to be haunted by familiar perfume, we headed to the hotel's rooftop bar for sunset. And there she was again, leaning against the railing with two friends, looking like an advertisement for making questionable choices, and she waved us over with a friendliness that might have been generous or dangerous. Sometimes, they look the same in golden hour. We chatted, my spouse and I side by side like a united front, and my ex turned out to be in one of those phases where everything becomes a confession after a cocktail and a sunset. So she started talking about why we broke up, not in a messy way, more like a guided museum tour of our history with occasional exhibits titled, Things That Could Have Gone Differently. And I laughed in that polite way you laugh when a memory taps you on the shoulder and asks if it can borrow a moment, while my spouse listened with a half smile like they were watching a documentary about a coastline they'd already chosen not to visit. At some point, the bartender arrived with a tray, and my ex insisted we all toast to new beginnings, which felt a little like toasting to fire safety while holding a candle near a curtain. But we did it, and for a fragile, fizzy minute, it was almost normal. Then the sky went navy, the music grew louder, and inevitably her friends drifted off, leaving the three of us in a little island of conversation where the current could pull any direction. My ex asked how married life felt after 48 hours, which is like asking a cake how it feels, right after the oven door opens, and my spouse answered with a sweetness that made me want to kiss them immediately. And I think that was the precise moment the mood shifted. My ex's smile flickered. Not in a jealous way exactly, more like she had found the sharp edge of the past in her pocket and hadn't realized she was carrying it. I suggested we call it a night, early snorkeling in the morning. Lots of sleep needed, and we did the awkward goodbye shuffle where you don't know if a hug would be a diplomatic bridge or an act of arson. And as we turned, she touched my elbow, a small echo of an old habit, and said quietly, "I'm happy for you." And for once I believed her, even if her eyes looked like they were reading a book only she could see. The next day, my spouse and I executed Operation Honeymoon like nothing weird happened, which meant shared pastries on the balcony, sunscreen negotiations, long floating conversations in the pool about the shape of our lives, and a mutual unspoken agreement not to go near the rooftop bar at sunset. We almost got through the day without incident until the hotel organized a silly couples game by the pool. You know, the kind, mostly harmless chaos where people toss rings and answer questions about who hogs the covers? And because the universe enjoys a motif, my ex and her friends wandered past at the exact moment the host asked me what my spouse's most annoying habit was. And I answered, too honestly, something about leaving wet towels on chairs like a breadcrumb trail of damp fabric. And my ex laughed in that precise way that says I remember. And I felt the hot prickle of past and present colliding like two waves. My spouse didn't miss it. They rarely miss anything. Later, in the cool quiet of our room, we had the conversation that happens when coincidence starts to feel like choreography. Did I still have feelings? Were we okay? Was I sure the past was a museum I visited only to appreciate the architecture? And I said yes to all the right things because they were true, and also because I could see the way my spouse needed the truth to be something they could exhale into. That night, we finally did the thing you're supposed to do on honeymoons, which is not merely trace each other's outlines but fill in all the colors. And afterwards, staring at the ceiling fan, I thought about how love can be both simple and a maze, sometimes in the same hour. Of course, the story didn't end there because love stories rarely obey simple narrative arcs when a hotel lobby is involved. And 2 days later, my ex slipped a note under our door. Old school drama, high production value, which said only, "Coffee? Closure?" And a time that conveniently coincided with my spouse's spa appointment, which had been booked before fate got cute with the guest list. I stared at the note like it might explode into glitter and sighs, then showed it to my spouse, who read it twice, lifted an eyebrow, and said, "Do you want to go?" And I said I didn't know, which was honest and irritating. And after a pause, they said, "If closure is what it is, get it." So I did the ridiculous thing and met my ex at the cafe by the lobby, where tourists compared sunburns and the espresso machine hissed like it was fed up with everyone's problems. And we sat at a tiny table and performed the ancient theater known as the post-mortem. She asked me if I was happy, which felt like a trick question wrapped in a compliment, and I said yes, and I meant it. And she nodded and told me her life was good in a way that sounded like she was trying it on for size. And then we talked about the version of us that might have existed if we had made different choices, back when everything was both fragile and loud. We acknowledged the ways we were terrible and wonderful and unfinished, and I told her that even though we didn't make sense long term, she had taught me a dozen quiet lessons I'd carried forward, like how to apologize without adding a comma, how to say I need you without making it a ransom note. And she smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that closes a chapter with its own soft click. When the coffee was just a ring at the bottom of the cup and the silence turned kind, she stood and said, "Okay then," which is romantic code for "we're done" in the nicest possible way. And I walked back to the room feeling like someone had opened a window I didn't know was painted shut. My spouse returned from the spa glowing and suspiciously fragrant, and I told them the whole truth without edits. And they listened without flinching, and then they kissed me with that steady, anchored warmth that says, "You are here now, we are here now, everything else is archaeology." After that, the hotel became what it was always meant to be, a place where we practiced being married, which looks a lot like deciding where to put the damp towels and who orders dessert, and how to be soft while the world is loud. We saw my ex in passing twice more, once on the beach picking shells with her friends, once in the elevator where we all did that polite micro smile you give acquaintances in former catastrophes. And each time it felt less like an omen and more like weather, something you notice and then walk through. On our last night, the pianist in the lobby switched to a love song from a decade ago, one I had danced to badly in a kitchen with my ex, but now it felt like a postcard from a city I used to live in. Sweet, distant, tidy, and I squeezed my spouse's hand and asked if they wanted to dance. right there in the lobby, among the suitcases and the orchids and the sound of ice and glasses, and we did, not gracefully, not for anyone else. Just a small loop of us moving together, and when the elevator dinged and the song ended, I realized the hotel had given me a souvenir I hadn't asked for. Proof that closure doesn't always arrive like a grand speech. Sometimes it's just the quiet relief of choosing the person who is holding your hand now, even when the past is standing across the marble floor in a sundress, smiling like a plot twist, and for once you don't need to read that chapter again. The secret kiss that happened behind the photo booth curtain. It started like every other wedding reception that wants to be remembered forever and simultaneously forgotten by noon the next day. All glitter and glassware and a dance floor that looked like a promise. And there, tucked beside the dessert table where a tower of cupcakes leaned against gravity, someone had rented one of those old-school photo booths, the kind with a squeaky stool and a flimsy curtain, and a tray that spits out a strip of images like it's dealing tiny, incriminating tarot cards. And from the moment the DJ announced its presence, the line never died. Not once. Because nothing attracts chaos like a camera that promises proof and plausible deniability in the same breath. I didn't plan to use it. I was there to clap, to toast, to dance badly in front of people who would forgive me. But the photo booth had a gravitational pull, and eventually my friend group, floating collectively on a warm cloud of champagne and nostalgia, drifted toward it with the kind of giddy purpose that ends in souvenirs you should hide in a drawer. The bride had told us to make memories, and that booth gobbled our intentions like candy. 4 poses each time, 3 seconds between frames, enough for joy to trip over itself and land in something truer. The first strip was silly. Oversized sunglasses, a plastic tiara, someone mid-sneeze immortalized like a Renaissance painting of chaos. And the second strip was sentimental. Foreheads pressed together, cheeks squished, the kind of closeness you only get when you have decided to love each other for a long time, even if you are not the people getting married. But the third strip is where the story actually begins, because by then he had joined the line. He was not a stranger exactly, he was a friend of a friend, a familiar name from group chats and tagged photos, a tall question mark in a navy suit. And when our eyes met, it felt like a glass had been tapped with a spoon, a quiet ring cutting through the music. He smiled like he'd been waiting to be let in on a joke, and someone, I will blame the loudest among us, waved him forward, insisting we all squeeze for one more round. And so it happened that I ended up on the squeaky stool with him beside me, our knees knocking. A curtain pulled, the world reduced to a velvet rectangle and the soft whir of a machine that didn't care about consequences. We made faces for the first frame. Tongues out, eyes crossed, safe nonsense. In the second, we tried to look serious and failed, dissolving into laughter with our heads tilted toward each other like flowers find the sun. But in the third frame, something tipped. The laughter softened. His hand found the back of the stool near my hip. Not touching, just close enough to be a weather system, and we both realized at the same time that we were inches from a line neither of us had planned to draw. It should be noted that there were complications. Of course there were. Because weddings are magnets for what-ifs. And he had a girlfriend in the city. They were on a break, which can mean almost anything, depending on who is telling the story and how much wine is in the glass. And I was not looking for drama. I was trying to be a person who dances and eats cake and goes home at a reasonable hour. But the curtain was closed. The room outside was a blur of bass and laughter, and time did a trick. Where it folded, and in the fourth frame, the one that always sneaks up on you, he kissed me. Not a performance, not a joke, but a soft, certain press that tasted like champagne and danger and the end of common sense. The booth flashed, sealing it in silver and dye, and then we were ejected back into the reception like kids slung off a carnival ride, blinking, guilty, bright. He looked at me with a stunned kind of joy and then remembered the world, remembered his break, remembered the not-quite-single tether that stretched between this ballroom and a different apartment, and he said my name like a question and an apology, and I said his like a dare and a retreat. And we did the only reasonable thing, which is to pretend for exactly 5 minutes that nothing had happened while the machine coughed out the proof. The strip dropped into the tray like a verdict, and my friend, oblivious, snatched it up with a cheer, already planning a scrapbook, and I could feel the color drain from my face as if the booth had stolen it with the flash. I almost grabbed it, almost made some joke about a bad angle or blurry eyes, but he was faster, a gentleman thief. He plucked the strip, slid it into his jacket pocket with an ease that suggested either experience or adrenaline, and said he needed air. I needed air too, but I did not follow him, because I have this rule where if a door swings open and you can hear the sound of your future crying on the other side, you let it swing shut. Instead, I went back to the dance floor, where the bride was spinning like a comet in white, and the groom was singing the wrong lyrics to the right song, and everyone was so beautifully alive in the way people are when they have decided the night will be golden no matter what. I danced hard enough to knock thoughts loose, and it worked until I saw him on the balcony through the glass doors, alone, leaning on the rail, the city below blinking like a gentle, accusatory constellation. I lasted 10 seconds before following. He didn't turn when the door shut. He knew it was me the way you know when a storm is coming by, the feel in your bones. And he took a breath that sounded like a hinge and said, "I shouldn't have," which is a sentence with 1,000 endings. And I said, "We can pretend we didn't," which is a sentence built like a bridge between now and later. And he pulled the photo strip from his pocket like evidence in a case that would never go to trial. We stood there looking at those 4 tiny boxes. Laughter, laughter, almost kiss, and he flipped it over, scrawled something on the white back with the hotel pen that had somehow migrated to his jacket, and then he tore the strip in half with neat, careful strength, handing me the frames where we were still a possibility and keeping the ones where we became a problem. And I laughed because it was either laugh or cry, and sometimes they taste the same. He said he was going to call her tomorrow to define the break, to end it or fix it, but not to leave it suspended like a question mark over other people's nights, and I believed him. Or maybe I just needed to believe someone could be that clean with their decisions. Inside, the song changed. Someone shrieked at a key change. Life kept happening like it didn't owe us a pause. We went back in separately because theater requires blocking, and I tucked my half of the strip into the tiny pocket of my dress, the one designed to carry exactly one secret, and I danced with my friends and cheered for the cake cutting, and cried during the late-night slow song because the bride's grandmother was on the floor with her walker like a queen, and we are all soft under our armor. He left early, a hand lifted in a small wave like a flag at half-mast, and I stayed late, helping collect centerpieces and inventing reasons to be the last to leave because sometimes moving slowly is how you keep from falling. The next morning, in the greasy sunshine of the diner where hangovers go to be forgiven, my friends compared photo strips like baseball cards, and I kept my purse closed like a door, and at some point my phone buzzed with a number. Not saved, but familiar, and a message that said, "Ended it. I'm sorry for last night. I'm also not sorry. Coffee?" And I stared at it while my eggs went cold because there are some invitations that are both kind and cruel. And I said I'd think about it, which is the honest way of saying I can feel the ground shifting under this day. I did meet him, not that morning, but 3 days later in a cafe with plants that crawled toward the windows as if sunlight were gossip. And we talked like careful people who had learned a lesson while holding a curtain shut. And he was good, gentle, precise, contrite without melodrama. And I was good too, clear about the way stories can write themselves if you hand them a pen. And we agreed that if anything was going to happen, it would happen in the daylight, with both hands visible, no curtains, no machines, and no four-frame fates hurrying us. Months have a way of stretching and collapsing around a maybe. And I will tell you this, we did not become a scandal, we did not ruin anyone's holiday card, and we did not get married in a flurry of photo booth strips, but we did date, slow and kind, and somewhere along the way he admitted he kept his half of the strip in a book on his nightstand. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that mistakes can be transformed into choices if you're brave and boring enough to do the work. We took a new photo booth picture on purpose one afternoon, in daylight, at a street fair where the machine was sun-faded and stubborn, and the 4 frames were ordinary in the best sense. Smiles, a nose bump, a wink, a kiss offered like a postscript. And when they slid into the tray, I didn't feel doomed. I felt documented. I still have my original half, the one where we were 2 frames away from trouble, and sometimes I look at it and think, how close we stand to the edge of our own stories without knowing, how a curtain and a flash can turn a joke into an address we live at for a while, and how, if we're lucky, we get to step out from behind the velvet, pay the bar tab, and walk into the night with our heads up, carrying only what we are willing to keep. The bridesmaid who vanished with the DJ. So here's how it all went down. A wedding reception that began like every other one you've ever seen. Sparkling centerpieces that looked like they belonged in a Pinterest board. Champagne glasses lined up like soldiers. The dance floor waiting patiently for disaster to arrive. And of course, the bride radiant, the groom glowing, and the bridal party buzzing around like bees in formal wear. Everything was running exactly on schedule, which is usually a red flag at weddings because something always happens. Some small catastrophe like a ring bearer tripping or cake collapsing. But nobody expected the night scandal to come in the form of a bridesmaid and a DJ. The DJ in question wasn't even the fancy kind. No elaborate light rigs or pyrotechnics. Just a guy in a crisp black shirt with a playlist that leaned heavily on early 2000s hits. The sort of guy you trust to keep the energy alive, but don't necessarily expect to become the main character. The bridesmaid was one of the bride's closest friends, the type who delivered a sweet toast earlier in the evening about friendship and loyalty and inside jokes only half the crowd understood. She looked stunning, of course, everyone did. That's the point of weddings. But nobody knew she was about to create the plot twist people would be talking about for years. At first, the dance floor was packed. Aunties twisting awkwardly to Beyoncé, uncles pulling out moves they hadn't used since college, kids sliding on their knees like human bowling balls, and the bride and groom in the middle, surrounded by laughter. The DJ was on fire, weaving songs together with just enough flair to make everyone believe he had a sixth sense for rhythm. The bridesmaid was front and center too, dancing, laughing, shouting lyrics into imaginary microphones, and all seemed normal. But as the night wore on, people noticed something odd. The playlist shifted from generic crowd pleasers to strangely specific love songs, the kind that felt like coded messages, and the bridesmaid seemed to vanish from the floor around the same time. At first, people assumed she'd gone to fix her makeup or change her shoes, but when she didn't return after 20 minutes, whispers started spreading. The bride noticed first, of course she did. A best friend-shaped hole is hard to miss on a night you're supposed to be surrounded by everyone you love. She sent another bridesmaid to look for her, who came back shaking her head, saying she'd checked the bathrooms and the photo booth, and even outside by the smokers. No luck. Then someone pointed out the DJ booth looked a little emptier than before, the playlist now running on autopilot. That's when realization hit. The DJ and the bridesmaid were both gone. Theories flew faster than the confetti. Some said they'd run off for a smoke, others whispered about long glances exchanged earlier in the evening, and one particularly tipsy groomsman claimed he'd seen them sneaking out through the kitchen doors. The bride, halfway between furious and faint, ordered a search party. Cousins fanned out across the venue like detectives in heels, peeking into storage rooms, knocking on locked doors, and at one point even checking under tables as though the two had shrunk themselves to hide. Meanwhile, the guests left behind were forced to endure the world's most awkward playlist loop. 3 straight plays of Cha-Cha Slide, followed by Hot in Here, which only made the gossip more electric. Finally, after nearly an hour, the missing duo reappeared. The DJ stumbled back in first, shirt rumpled, hair messy, looking like he'd wrestled a windstorm and lost. A minute later, the bridesmaid followed, cheeks flushed, lipstick smudged, holding her shoes in her hand, and wearing an expression that tried very hard to be casual but was absolutely guilty. The crowd didn't need confirmation. The scene wrote itself. The bride's eyes nearly shot sparks, the groom's jaw clenched, and the maid of honor whispered something so sharp it could have cut glass. But before anyone could demand an explanation, the DJ grabbed the mic, mumbled something about technical difficulties, and cranked up the volume on Shut Up and Dance, hoping the music would bury the truth. It didn't. The rest of the night was a blur of side eyes and whispers. The bride and bridesmaid avoided each other completely, orbiting the room like rival planets, while the DJ kept his head down and played songs on shuffle, occasionally sneaking glances toward the exit like he was planning a second escape. By the end of the reception, everyone knew what had happened, or at least their own version of it, and the scandal became legend before the cake was even boxed up. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was messy. The bride and her best friend had a spectacular fight, the kind you can hear even through locked doors, and though nobody knows the exact words, the story is that the phrase, "on my wedding day," was repeated no less than 17 times. The bridesmaid tried to defend herself, insisting it was just a moment and not a betrayal, but the damage was done. She wasn't in the group photos anymore, she wasn't tagged in the Instagram posts, and she definitely wasn't invited to the brunch the next morning. As for the DJ, he was quietly replaced by a Spotify playlist at the next family event. And that's how this wedding, which should have been remembered for vows and flowers and first dances, instead went down in history as the one where the bridesmaid vanished with the DJ. Years later, people still bring it up at reunions, always with a smirk and a shake of the head. Because while most weddings blur together into a haze of white dresses and buffet lines, this one had a scandal that kept the memory alive, tucked into the folds of every whispered conversation, a reminder that no matter how carefully you plan, the wild card will always find its way to the dance floor. The dinner party, where the wrong couple was caught under the table. It started as one of those painfully curated adult evenings that pretend to be casual, the kind where the host says, "Oh, it's nothing fancy," while setting out cloth napkins folded like origami water lilies, and a cheese board with labels that require a minor in French to decode. And I had been invited because I am apparently the kind of friend who can be counted on to arrive on time, laugh at the right moments, and text the next morning to say, "Such a lovely night." Which is to say, I was not emotionally prepared for the way the evening would set itself on fire and roast our collective composure like a marshmallow you swear you're watching closely, and then suddenly it's a torch. The dining room glowed warmly, all candles and flattering lamplight, the sort of lighting that makes everyone look like they have slept 8 hours and drank enough water and forgiven their enemies. The table was dressed within an inch of its life, with gold-rimmed plates and linen runners and a centerpiece made of flowers so tightly arranged they looked like they were holding their breath. Our hosts, a couple who love hosting with the fervor of people who believe hospitality is a sport, floated around topping off glasses and offering olives as if they were dispensing small blessings. And the guest list was a tasteful blend of longtime friends and new faces, sprinkled with exactly one person who has a reputation for stories that start with, "This probably isn't appropriate, but," which is how you know a plot twist has RSVP'd. For the first hour, we were all exceptional versions of ourselves. Good posture, harmless jokes, delicate forays into politics that ended with graceful pivots to travel or regional pastries. And somewhere between the second pour of Pinot and the third pass of rosemary almonds, we reached that giddy level of conviviality where you start to believe the universe is a kind place. The first course arrived, a soup that tasted like autumn had leaned down and kissed the bowl, and conversation shifted to comfortable, glittering lanes. Who's traveling where? Who changed jobs? Who secretly adopted a rescue cat that hates them? And my attention wandered just enough to notice a curious energy humming at the far end of the table, where Mia and Evan sat next to each other, exchanging the kind of glances that look like swallowed sentences. I say curious because Mia did not arrive with Evan. She arrived with Noah, her boyfriend of almost a year, and Evan arrived with Lila, who had spent the first half hour describing their new apartment's natural light with such devotion, I briefly considered asking for a candlelit moment of silence in its honor. Now, glances happen, we are human, and faces are curious creatures, but these glances were humid, the kind that carry tiny weather systems, and if I had been a better person, I might have politely looked away. But instead I filed it under intriguing and went back to pretending I could tell the difference between the good olive oil and the very good. The entree came out in a ballet of platters and compliments. Roasted chicken with crispy skin, a tangle of lemony greens, potatoes that managed to be both crunchy and cloud-like. And by then the room had warmed into that fuzzy lane where laughter lands softer and secrets feel like they could slip out without cracking a glass. Someone told a story about a disastrous Airbnb, the kind with towels the size of napkins, and a neighbor who practiced the trombone at dawn. And while we laughed, I noticed that Noah had excused himself, heading down the hallway toward the bathroom. And Lila did the same a minute later, and still fine, normal. Bathrooms are communal property at dinner parties. What made my eyebrows climb was the way, 30 seconds later, Mia's napkin slid onto her chair and she murmured something about checking on the sauce to our hostess, who did not have a sauce that needed checking, and then, in a move that would later make me question whether I had actually been present at my own life, Evan stood up to help with the wine, though all the bottles were happily breathing on the sideboard like sunbathers. I followed none of them with my eyes because I like being invited to things in the future. But the room noticed their synchronized absence like a chord dropping out of a song, and the host filled the gap with a flourish of conversation about a regional farmer's market that sells figs that taste like poems. And we all tried very hard to be the sort of people who do not count chairs or wonder why the air suddenly felt like a whisper. 10 minutes passed, then 11, and somewhere around minute 12 the hostess rose, a swan in linen, and drifted toward the kitchen to check on imaginary sauce. And I told myself that adults are allowed to be wherever they please in a house full of consenting small talk. I told myself that coincidence happens all the time, like rain that only falls on one side of the street. I told myself that the potatoes really were remarkable, perhaps because I needed something to believe in while the universe rearranged the seating chart. It was our host, the other half, the one who approaches problems with the optimism of a man certain he can fix a wobbly chair with only a butter knife, who finally went looking. He disappeared down the hall where the bathroom door was cracked and the kitchen hummed, and the den's lights were low for ambience, and he returned 5 seconds later with a face arranged into what I can only describe as the expression of a person who has tripped over a plot twist and is now carrying it back to the table like a tray he cannot set down. He did not say a word, he did not need to, because behind him, our hostess re-entered with a smile that sparkled in the exact way a smile does when everything is both fine and on fire. And then, with the kind of cheerfulness reserved for kindergarten teachers and surgeons, she suggested we all take our dessert plates into the living room for a cozier vibe, which is when we saw them. Not immediately, of course, because we are polite, but eventually our eyes adjusted to the room's lower light, and under the long farm table connected to the kitchen island, an architectural choice our hosts were very proud of, there were shoes. 4 shoes specifically, not aligned with the shoes we had all kicked off at the door, and a single bare foot, which is an image that will live rent-free in my psyche until I die. There was also, it turned out, a witness. The couple's ancient golden retriever, who had stationed himself beside the table like a guard who has seen things and cannot be bribed, tail-thumping an unhelpfully rhythmic commentary as the tablecloth trembled with the unmistakable choreography of adults making poor choices in a horizontal, linen-swathed environment. Silence is a rare mineral at dinner parties. We mined a vein of it so pure you could hear a crumble of pastry give up on gravity. The host and hostess exchanged a look that could have been a marriage vow renewal or a hostage negotiation. It was hard to tell. Someone coughed, someone else said, "Oh," in the tone of a person who has just found out their favorite museum is haunted. The dog sneezed as if to punctuate the reveal, and in that blessed canine exclamation, Mia and Evan emerged like shy stagehands caught in the spotlight, faces flushed, hair in charming disarray, the universal hand gestures of apology flapping uselessly in the air. They stood, they straightened, they offered a duet of "This is not what it looks like," which is a line that has never once been true in the history of table linens. At that exact moment, Fate, who loves a laugh, delivered Noah from the bathroom and Lila from the powder room, like polite planets arriving on their orbits. They stepped into the kitchen in time to see their respective partners mid-recalibration, and all the air left the house through a window that wasn't even open. What followed was not shouting at first. No, the opening act was the sort of brittle, icy composure that makes you fear for the structural integrity of glassware. Lila asked in a voice crisp enough to exfoliate whether this had been brewing, which was a generous verb for what we had all just witnessed simmering under our salad course. And Mia started to cry the way people cry when they're surprised to find out they are the main character in a story they only meant to cameo in. Evan offered 10 consecutive sentences that began with, "I'm so sorry." And Noah, who I had always thought of as the human equivalent of a soft sweater, went very, very still, which is somehow more terrifying than yelling. Our hosts, who deserve medals, shifted into crisis hospitality mode. Coffee appeared, water was offered, the dog was banished reluctantly to the yard. The rest of us were collected with gentle hands and steered toward the living room where the candles were. In hindsight, a mistake, because everything looked like a painting of a scandal, you'd see in a museum with a plaque that says, Domestic Scene, 1847. We were told to help ourselves to dessert, which felt like asking passengers on a listing ship to sample the petit fours. And so we did, because cake is a life raft, and forks are oars. And in the kitchen, the world's most awkward summit unfolded. Words floated out in careful fragments history, chemistry, mistakes, timing, and then found their volume because eventually someone had to pick up the center of the mess and carry it somewhere. And when voices did rise, they did so in waves, a swell of accusation followed by an undertow of apology, followed by the crash of realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision, even if it had been made impulsively under a table where no good decision has ever been born. I will not pretend I didn't hear the line, on a runner my grandmother hand-stitched, which came from our hostess and was fair. And I will not pretend I didn't admire the way the host gently but firmly suggested that any couples who needed to have an extended conversation might consider doing so on the front porch where the night air could keep them from spontaneously combusting. And so, like an exquisitely dressed migration, we drifted. Lila and Evan to the porch swing, Noah and Mia to the front steps, our remaining cohort into a circle of mismatched armchairs where we pretended to discuss the merits of meringue while periodically exchanging telepathic updates about the weather systems brewing outside. Time stretched, the candles guttered, the dog sighed against the patio door like a monk. At some point, the hostess sat with us, brave and brittle, and made a joke so dry it could have been kindling, and we all laughed the way people laugh when they have realized adulthood is not so much a staircase as a series of rickety ladders leaned against questionable walls. Eventually, the porch conversations reached their respective cliffs. Lila came in first, chin up, keys already in hand, offering the kind of farewell that is really a thesis statement. She would not be returning to the apartment with its heroic natural light. Not tonight, not again. She thanked our host for the chicken and the revelation. She kissed the dog on the head and left with the grace of an empress exiting a battlefield. Noah followed, softer, eyes red, saying he would text tomorrow, not to Mia but to our host to apologize for the way the evening had turned into a group project nobody had signed up for. Evan and Mia remained outside longer, silhouettes in the street lamp glow, two shapes negotiating a future in real time. And when they finally re-entered, it was as separate people, which is to say they did not hold hands, they did not make announcements, they just collected their coats, the wrong ones at first, which felt metaphorical, and thanked the people whose table they had turned into a confessional. The rest of us did the ritual cleanup that stands in for comfort, stacking plates, running water until it ran hot, pressing lids onto plastic containers with the solemnity of monks copying manuscripts, and our hostess, who is made of something resilient and darkly sparkling, insisted she was fine, that she had seen worse, though I could not imagine worse unless lightning physically struck the souffle. When we finally left, the night air was cool and ordinary, a rude little reminder that outside the world continues without checking whether the dining room has resolved its subplot. And in the car, I sat in silence for a long block, listening to the engine purr and my phone ping as the group chat birthed itself like a star. In the days that followed, the story crisped and cooled into lore. There were versions, of course. Some gave it the tragic romance angle, two souls who simply couldn't help themselves. Others filed it under cautionary tales, a reminder that proximity plus wine equals math you will regret. A few, mostly the kind of people who iron their dish towels, focused on the table runner and held a moment of silence. The practical outcomes were less cinematic. Lila moved in with her sister. Noah began a relationship with morning runs and a therapist who apparently asks excellent questions. And Evan and Mia tried, I think, for a while the way people do when a house fire reveals the blueprint under the paint. Months later, I returned to our host's home for another dinner. Smaller, warmer, the table runner replaced by a plain one that looked like it could keep a secret, and we toasted to resilience with something sparkling and kind. At some point, the dog thumped his tail under my chair, and I nearly choked on nostalgia, and we laughed because that is what you do when you survive something absurd together. You fold it into your shared language, and you take another bite of lemon tart, and you agree, unanimously, never to seat certain people side by side again. And if, when the candles burned low, someone told the story again, this time with gentler edges and a laugh track, we let them, because some nights go down not as catastrophes but as chapters. Footnotes with good crockery, reminders that the adult table is where the mess sometimes is, and that chairs, like hearts, can be moved a little further apart until everyone remembers how to breathe. The cabin weekend, where the fireplace wasn't the only thing heating up. It was pitched to us as a UAE wholesome escape from city noise, the kind of long weekend where you drink cocoa in oversized mugs, play board games you never finish, and sit around a crackling fireplace talking about nothing important until the snow outside turns the world into a snow globe. A group of 8 friends, mixed couples and singles, had chipped in for a rustic cabin with more character than insulation, tucked away far enough into the woods that your phone service became a rumor the moment you turned off the highway. We arrived in waves, dragging coolers and duffel bags, and exactly 3 too many bags of marshmallows. Everyone buzzing with the relief of being away from work and screens, and that one neighbor who insists on practicing the trumpet at ungodly hours. The first night was pure postcard material. Fire roaring, wine poured, someone burning the first batch of s'mores while claiming it was on purpose. By the second night, though, the cabin's walls, thin as secrets, began to magnify everything. And I don't just mean the sound of snow sliding off the roof or the creaks of the floorboards. I mean the fact that tension has its own volume when you stuff 8 people with history into one wooden box. It started with a glance, or maybe it started before that, maybe months before, simmering quietly under layers of friendship. But all I know is that while we were playing charades by the fire, one of the singles, let's call him Alex, kept locking eyes with one of the not-so-singles, let's call her Claire, while her boyfriend sat oblivious, arguing passionately that his impression of Penguin was spot on. Nobody said anything, but everyone saw something. Later, after more wine than wisdom, people drifted off to their rooms. The fire burned lower, the playlist shifted from upbeat to soft, and I decided to step outside for air. That's when I saw shadows flicker through the curtains of the side room, the one nobody was really supposed to use except for storage. 2 figures. Close. Too close. I told myself I was imagining it, that the wine was painting stories where there were none, and I walked back to the fire. But not 5 minutes later, laughter spilled from that room. Hushed, breathless, the kind of laughter that only exists on the razor's edge between guilt and thrill. By morning, the room was neat, blankets folded as if nothing had happened. Breakfast was awkward, though. Claire avoided eye contact. Alex whistled tunelessly, and her boyfriend was still rambling about wanting to hike after pancakes, completely unaware he had already become the tragic figure in a play everyone else was watching. The rest of us tiptoed around it, filling the air with chatter about maple syrup and snowshoe rentals, but the undercurrent was louder than the coffee maker. And that night, when the fire roared again and the wine came back out, it happened once more. The vanishing act. This time they were caught not by shadows, but by absence. Her boyfriend noticed. His question, "Where's Claire?" landed like a log tossed onto the fire, sparks flying. Nobody answered. Eventually they came back in, cheeks redder than the flames, and the silence that followed was its own kind of confession. Claire's boyfriend stood, walked outside into the snow without a coat, and the rest of us sat frozen, listening to the fire pop and crack, while Alex poured himself another glass of wine he definitely didn't need. The trip didn't end early. We stayed the full weekend, because logistics and pride and snowstorms kept us there. But it ended in a kind of truce made of silence. Claire and her boyfriend left in separate cars. Alex offered half-hearted goodbyes, and the rest of us pretended to be charmed by the cabin one last time, while knowing it had turned into a stage for a story nobody wanted to star in. Years later, when someone brings it up, we don't call it the winter cabin trip. We call it the weekend, where the fireplace wasn't the only thing heating up, and every time the room fills with knowing laughter, a little sharp around the edges, because the fire may have burned out, the snow may have melted, but that heat, the kind that scorches trust, left a mark no one could quite forget. The holiday flight, where I sat next to my old flame. It was supposed to be an ordinary holiday flight, the kind where you brace yourself for crying babies, stale pretzels, and the passive-aggressive war over the armrest with a stranger you'll never see again. Except when I walked down the narrow aisle with my carry-on threatening to decapitate someone, I looked up and froze because there he was, my old flame, the one who once burned so brightly it felt like the world tilted to watch, sitting in seat 14B like fate had decided to get into stand-up comedy and the punchline was me. He hadn't noticed me yet. He was fiddling with the in-flight magazine like it contained state secrets, his hair a little shorter than I remembered, his jawline still unfairly sharp, and my heart decided to reenact a drum solo while my brain screamed that surely the airline's seating algorithm wasn't this cruel. Except of course it was because my boarding pass said 14A, the seat right next to him. I slid in with the grace of a collapsing deck chair, muttering apologies as I wrestled my bag under the seat. And when I finally looked up, he was staring at me with that startled half smile that says, "Are you real or am I hallucinating on recycled cabin air?" We exchanged the kind of hello people do when the universe has played a prank, and there's no polite way out. And for a few beats, we just sat there, awkwardly adjusting seatbelts and pretending we didn't once know the exact rhythm of each other's breathing in the dark. The flight attendants went through their safety routine while my pulse rehearsed an Olympic sprint. And when the plane rumbled down the runway, I thought maybe we'd keep it civil, exchange a few bland updates, and then retreat into silence. But altitude does strange things to people. Something about being sealed in a pressurized tube 30,000 feet above land makes confessions slip out easier. And before we even hit cruising altitude, he asked the question. "So, how have you been?" Simple words, dangerous question. I told him the safe version. Work was fine, family fine, holidays hectic, travel exhausting. But he gave me that look, the one that says he could tell when I was holding something back, and suddenly it was 14B and 14A against the world again. He told me about his life too, the places he'd been, the job he was still pretending to like, the girlfriend he no longer had. I nodded politely at that part, trying not to look like my brain had just lit sparklers because I didn't want to read too much into it. Except his tone had that unfinished sentence flavor, like he was leaving space for me to fill in. Hours passed strangely fast and strangely slow. The flight attendants brought drinks, and we clinked plastic cups of ginger ale like it was champagne. At some point, the overhead lights dimmed, casting the cabin in that strange twilight that feels suspended between day and night, and the quiet made space for memory. He leaned closer, his arm brushing mine, and whispered a joke about the snoring man across the aisle, and the closeness felt like no time had passed at all. I remembered road trips where we sang until our voices cracked, late nights where the silence was its own kind of conversation, mornings where coffee tasted like a promise. It was disorienting how easily the past slid into the present, how the hum of the engine sounded like an old song. Then came turbulence. Not the metaphorical kind, actual turbulence, the plane jolting like it had tripped over a cloud. People gasped, a soda can rolled down the aisle, and without thinking I grabbed his hand. He squeezed back instantly, steady and warm, and we sat like that through the bumps. Two people who once promised forever now clinging through a patch of sky like it was the only ground we had. When the turbulence eased, I tried to let go, but he didn't, not right away. And when he finally did, we both laughed nervously like teenagers caught sneaking back past curfew. Dinner service arrived, which is generous considering it was a foil-wrapped mystery labeled chicken or pasta, but we picked at our trays and shared bites like we had once done in kitchens filled with better food and worse lighting. He teased me for still picking the M&Ms out of trail mix. I teased him for drowning everything in hot sauce, and the familiarity felt like a secret language no one else on the plane spoke. Eventually, conversation grew softer, slower, drifting into the dangerous territory of what if. He asked if I ever thought about us, not accusatory, just curious, like someone poking at embers to see if they'd glow. I admitted I did sometimes in those quiet, late-night moments when the world is too still, and he smiled that small, sad smile of someone who knows exactly what I meant. We didn't kiss. Not there. Not in the cabin filled with strangers and crying babies and a flight attendant side-eyeing anyone who lingered too long near the bathroom. But there was a moment when the lights dimmed again and most of the passengers dozed off, where our shoulders leaned together, his head tilted slightly toward mine, and it felt like we were in a bubble carved out of time. A secret chapter between the pages of two lives that had already turned. We talked until our voices were soft with exhaustion, about who we used to be and who we were now, about the ways we'd grown and the ways we hadn't, about regrets and about forgiveness. And somewhere over a patch of midnight ocean, he said, "Maybe in another life." And I whispered, "Maybe." When the plane landed, the spell broke. Phones pinged with messages. People scrambled for luggage. Reality came rushing back in. We stood in the aisle, shuffling forward with everyone else, and he looked at me like he wanted to say something monumental, but instead he just said, "Take care." And I echoed it, because sometimes that's all you can do. We walked off the plane together, but split at the terminal. Him turning left, me turning right. No promises, no plans. Just the echo of a flight where the past sat down beside me and reminded me how it once felt to burn. And now, whenever someone asks me about strange coincidences or travel stories, I don't mention lost luggage or crying babies. I remember the holiday flight where I sat next to my old flame, the way the sky held us in its hands for a few fleeting hours, the way turbulence made me grab his hand, the way his smile still felt like a spark even after all that time. And I remember how sometimes closure doesn't come in grand speeches or dramatic reunions. Sometimes it comes at 30,000 feet in a cramped row of seats, with plastic cups of ginger ale and a quiet, maybe whispered into the hum of an endless sky. The beach bonfire that turned into something more. It was supposed to be the most harmless night of the summer, a simple gathering of friends around a bonfire on the sand. The kind of evening you romanticize later when you're stuck in traffic or hunched over a spreadsheet, all laughter carried by salt air and sparks floating up into a star-heavy sky. The kind of night where the worst thing that happens is someone burns a marshmallow so badly it resembles a meteorite. I had been invited at the last minute, tossed into the group text by a friend of a friend who promised it would be chill, which is always the word people use right before something decidedly unchill happens. I showed up with a six-pack and low expectations, flip-flops slapping the boardwalk, hoodie zipped against the ocean breeze, and when I crested the dune and saw the fire flickering below, my first thought was that it looked like a painting, all glowing faces and moving shadows, the whole scene tucked into the dark like a secret. My second thought, the one that hit harder, was that he was there. He, of course, being the one I hadn't expected to see again, not in this town, not this summer, maybe not ever. We hadn't ended badly exactly, but we hadn't ended gracefully either. It was one of those drifting aparts that leaves words unsaid and glances unfinished, the kind of ending that doesn't slam the door but leaves it cracked, just enough for memory to slip through at inconvenient moments. He was leaning back in the sand, hoodie pulled tight, firelight turning his profile into something almost mythic, and when his eyes caught mine across the flames, I felt that familiar jolt, the one I'd convinced myself I'd outgrown. We didn't rush to each other, this wasn't a movie, we just nodded like polite acquaintances, though everyone else might as well have been invisible because the fire had drawn a line between us, a heat that wasn't only from the wood. I took a seat across the circle, close enough to see him clearly, far enough to pretend I hadn't arranged myself like a satellite orbiting his gravity. The night unfolded the way nights like that do. Someone pulled out a guitar, someone else told an exaggerated story about almost getting arrested for climbing a water tower, marshmallows roasted, beers cracked open, laughter riding the surf. And yet underneath all of it was that hum, that awareness, the magnetic pull of a conversation we hadn't finished years ago. Eventually, someone suggested a walk, and before I could overthink it, he was beside me, offering a hand up like we hadn't spent months avoiding each other's names. We drifted down the shoreline, the fire shrinking behind us, the ocean hissing secrets at our feet, and the air between us was so thick with almost words it was a miracle we could breathe. At first it was safe chatter. Work, family, how weird it felt to be back in this town like ghosts revisiting the place where we once lived. But then the questions got sharper. Did I still think about him? Sometimes. Did he regret how we left things? Often. Did I want to know the truth he never said? Absolutely. And there, with the waves swallowing our footsteps and the stars pressing down like witnesses, he admitted it. He had been scared back then, too young to know what to do with the depth of it, too unsure of himself to trust it could last. I admitted my own truth, that I had wanted him to fight for it, that when he didn't, I convinced myself I didn't care. even though I did. We stopped walking at the edge of the surf, water licking our toes, and for a moment, the silence between us was louder than the ocean. Then he reached for my hand, tentative but certain, and it was like plugging into a current I'd only half forgotten. The fire in the distance was just a dot now, our friends laughing too far away to hear us, and the night wrapped itself around us like a secret. When he kissed me, it wasn't dramatic. No fireworks or orchestral swells, just the steady, inevitable press of something that had been waiting patiently, and it felt both brand new and achingly familiar. We stayed out there longer than we should have, talking, kissing, laughing softly at the absurdity of it all, until finally we wandered back to the bonfire, trying to look casual, though I'm sure the sand in our hair and the glow on our faces betrayed us. Nobody said anything, not then, but the sideways smiles told me we weren't as discreet as we thought. The fire burned low, the group began to scatter, and by the time the last log crumbled into embers, I knew the night would follow me forever, not just because of what had happened, but because of how inevitable it had felt. Now, whenever I smell smoke on the breeze or hear the crash of waves in the dark, I think of the beach bonfire that turned into something more, of sparks rising into the sky while something old reignited in the sand, of how endings aren't always endings. Sometimes they're just pauses waiting for the right night, the right fire, the right confession whispered against the sound of the sea. The night the wrong key card opened the right room. Airports always make me feel like I've been chewed up and spit out. So by the time I landed in that city, dragging a suitcase that had already lost a wheel and wearing a hoodie that smelled faintly like airplane pretzels, I was ready for nothing more than a shower and a bed. The hotel wasn't glamorous. Just one of those chain places near the conference center, where the carpets are suspiciously patterned to hide stains, and the elevators play jazz that sounds like it's dying. But it promised clean sheets, and that was enough. The woman at the desk handed me a key card, smiled with the practiced cheer of someone who'd been saying, "Enjoy your stay" for 8 hours straight, and I trudged toward the elevator, already rehearsing how quickly I could collapse. I got to my floor, found the door with my number, slid the card in, and the light blinked green with that little electronic beep that feels like success. I pushed open the door, wheeled my bag in, and that's when I froze because the room wasn't empty. There was luggage already by the wall, shoes lined up neatly by the bed, a laptop open on the desk, glowing faintly. And on the bed itself, sprawled on top of the covers with a paperback, balanced on their chest, was a man. Not just any man. One who looked up at me with the startled eyes of someone who has just realized they're being broken up with by fate. For one long, electric moment, we just stared at each other. Me holding my keycard like a weapon made of plastic, him blinking as if I were a dream. And then he sat up, the book sliding to the floor. "You're not housekeeping," he said, voice low, careful, like maybe I was a ghost. "No," I managed, heart hammering. "I think they gave me the wrong room." He laughed then, not mocking, more incredulous, and ran a hand through his hair in a gesture so disarmingly casual it cracked the tension. "Well, welcome anyway," he said. "Do you always break into strangers' rooms at night?" I should have left right then, should have backed out with apologies and marched back to the front desk to demand a new key. But something about the situation, the surrealness, the warmth of the lamp on his face, the way his smile tugged like a secret, made me linger. I stammered something about bad luck and hotels being terrible at organization, and he patted the chair across from him. "You came all this way," he said. "Might as well sit a minute." So I did. Against all reason, I sat, my bag abandoned by the door, and suddenly the strangeness melted into conversation. His name was Daniel. He was in town for the same conference as me, though for a different company, which explained why the desk clerk had probably mixed us up. We swapped horror stories about flights, laughed about the depressing coffee in the lobby, and compared notes on our mutual dislike for the conference's keynote speaker who apparently had a reputation for turning PowerPoint slides into a form of torture. Minutes blurred. The awkwardness of our accidental meeting gave way to a kind of intimacy that felt dangerous. Because here's the thing. Sometimes strangers are easier to talk to than friends. Sometimes you can be braver with someone who doesn't know your history, someone you might never see again. At some point, I admitted I hadn't wanted to come to the conference at all, that I felt out of place in my job, like I was wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. He admitted he felt the same, that he'd almost quit that very week, that he was staying in this hotel mostly because he couldn't face the silence of going home yet. We shared our doubts, our frustrations, and then, because vulnerability is contagious, we shared more. Old heartbreaks, family dramas, the scars we'd tucked away behind business casual smiles. And somewhere between confessions and laughter, I realized the distance between our chairs had shrunk. Not physically, but atmospherically, like the air itself was leaning closer. Then came the silence, the heavy kind that hums with possibility. He looked at me, really looked, and the world outside that hotel room disappeared. No conference, no baggage, no wrong keycards, just two people in a space that wasn't supposed to be theirs, suspended in a moment that felt stolen. And when he reached out, slow enough to let me stop him if I wanted, and brushed his fingers against mine, I didn't pull away. I leaned in. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, like testing a match to see if it will catch, and then it deepened, the fire catching quickly, hungrily, until we were both breathless. My brain screamed about consequences, about how ridiculous this was, about how I'd literally walked into the wrong room, but my heart, my body, every part of me alive in that moment drowned it out. For once, I didn't overthink. I just let it happen. We didn't sleep together that night, not all the way. We kissed, we touched, we let the tension unravel just enough to feel dangerous without tipping into chaos, and then, when the weight of what we were doing pressed too heavy, I pulled back. He respected it immediately, brushing a kiss against my forehead instead, and we lay there talking until exhaustion claimed us. Me curled on top of the covers beside him, like two kids at a sleepover who had stumbled into adulthood by accident. In the morning, sunlight streamed in far too brightly, reality knocking on the door with checkout times and conference schedules. We woke tangled, laughing at how absurd it was, and agreed we couldn't stay. I gathered my things, slipped back into the hallway, and returned the keycard at the desk with a pointed look that made the clerk flush crimson. They gave me a new room, one that was mine alone, but by then it already felt empty. At the conference, we spotted each other across crowded ballrooms, exchanged small smiles that held entire conversations, but we didn't push it. It wasn't about forever, not even about tomorrow. It was about that night, that mistake that wasn't a mistake, that room that wasn't supposed to be mine, but somehow was exactly where I needed to be. And now, whenever I check into a hotel and slide a keycard into the slot, I remember the night the wrong keycard opened the right room. Not because it led to love, not because it changed my life in sweeping ways, but because it reminded me that sometimes accidents aren't accidents at all. Sometimes fate dresses up like a tired hotel clerk, hands you the wrong card, and dares you to walk through the door anyway. The birthday surprise that revealed too much. It was supposed to be the kind of birthday party that lives on Instagram stories for 24 hours and then gently dissolves into memory. A sweet, harmless night where balloons droop against the ceiling, confetti sticks to your shoes, and the only drama is whether there's enough cake to sneak a second slice before the candles are even blown out. The plan had been simple. A surprise party for our friend, Hannah, her 30th. A milestone that demanded streamers and heartfelt toasts and a playlist designed to straddle nostalgia and irony. We'd booked a cozy private room at her favorite restaurant, the kind with dim lighting and too many Edison bulbs, smuggled in a cake the size of a tire, and whispered furiously at each other while checking the clock every 2 minutes. When she finally walked in, face wide with shock, hands flying to her mouth, the room erupted in cheers and camera flashes, and for a moment, it was perfect. The kind of reveal you replay in your mind with satisfaction. But the thing about surprises is they don't always end with the reveal. Sometimes the surprise has a sequel. The first hour was bliss. Drinks flowed, appetizers disappeared, everyone hugged and laughed and told stories about Hannah's college antics and high school hairstyles, each anecdote more exaggerated than the last. She was glowing, overwhelmed in the best way, And I remember thinking how proud I was that we'd managed to pull it off without a single leak of information. We had kept the group chat locked down, timed our arrivals like a covert operation, and for once everything had gone according to plan. At least until the gifts. Gifts at a surprise party are always a gamble. Half of them thoughtful, half of them re-gifted candles. But Hannah loved them all, ripping tissue paper with theatrical gasps. A necklace, a spa voucher, a framed photo of the friend group, looking young and wild at a music festival years ago. Then came the envelope. It was slim, white, tucked innocently among the wrapped boxes, no name on the front. She opened it with the same enthusiasm as the others, slid out the card and began to read the message aloud, because that was the mood of the night, laughter and sharing. Except halfway through, her voice faltered. The handwriting was elegant, almost too elegant, the kind that belongs to someone who practices more than they write, and the words were not generic birthday cheer. They were personal, intimate. They spoke of the fire between us and our secret nights, and ended with a line that made the air in the room shatter. I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore. Signed simply, yours. For a moment, nobody moved, as if the entire room had been vacuum sealed. Hannah's cheeks flushed crimson, her hands trembled, and the laughter that had been bubbling a second earlier collapsed into silence sharp enough to hear a fork drop. The guests glanced at each other, at her, at the envelope like it was ticking. And then, in the corner, her boyfriend, well, the man we thought was her boyfriend, cleared his throat. He wasn't smiling. It was one of those moments you wish you could rewind, shove the envelope back under the pile, replace it with another scented candle, anything to undo the unraveling. Hannah tried to laugh, stammering something about a prank, probably from one of us, but her boyfriend's expression didn't budge. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on hers with a mix of hurt and accusation, and you could feel the room tilt, every guest suddenly an unwilling witness to a private reckoning. Someone coughed nervously. Someone else muttered, "Maybe it's just a joke." But the handwriting was too careful, the words too raw. The boyfriend asked in a voice low and cutting, "Who is it?" And Hannah, sweet, glowing, caught Hannah, said nothing. That silence was its own answer. The party, of course, imploded. Some guests pretended to keep drinking, talking too loudly about anything else, while others sat frozen, unable to look away. A couple of people excused themselves to the bathroom and never returned, as though escaping meant absolution. I stood rooted, helpless, watching the birthday candles drip wax into the cake while the guest of honor tried to put out a fire with her bare hands. She swore it was complicated. She swore it wasn't what it looked like. She swore she still loved him. But her boyfriend, ex-boyfriend by the end of the night, shook his head, stood up, and left, the door closing behind him with a thud that echoed louder than the music. Hannah tried to laugh again, tried to wave it off, but her eyes shimmered with the truth, and none of us knew what to do. Do you keep celebrating? Do you sing happy birthday when someone's heart has just been split open on the table? In the end, we did sing, voices shaky, off-key, as if to pretend the night was salvageable, as if sugar and smoke could patch what had been torn. Hannah blew out the candles with tears on her cheeks, and the wish she made was one we all pretended not to guess. The cake was sliced, the drinks refilled, but the mood never recovered. The surprise had revealed too much, not just the party, but the truth she hadn't been ready to confess. Afterward, the envelope became legend. Some swore it had been planted by the mystery lover themselves, a bold declaration timed to detonate. Others believed it was a mistake, the wrong envelope grabbed in a rush, a secret meant for private eyes only. Hannah never clarified and we never pressed because the silence itself became part of the story. Now, whenever birthdays roll around and someone suggests a surprise party, there's always a pause, a glance exchanged, a memory of that night. And inevitably someone says with a wry smile, "Just maybe skip the envelopes this time." Because we'll never forget the birthday surprise that revealed too much, the night balloons floated aimlessly against the ceiling while a room full of friends realized that sometimes the biggest surprises aren't the ones you plan. but the ones that slip out, ink on paper, words too sharp to stay hidden. The coworker who stayed, after everyone else went home. It started as one of those late evenings in the office where the fluorescent lights hum louder than your thoughts, and the silence of empty cubicles presses in like a second skin. The kind of night you tell yourself will be productive, but mostly turns into staring at spreadsheets until the numbers blur into abstract art. Everyone else had filtered out hours earlier, waving tired goodbyes and muttering promises to pick things up tomorrow. And I had been ready to leave too, coat halfway on, when I noticed another light still glowing 2 rows down. At first I thought it was the cleaning crew, but then I saw him. My coworker, the one who always seemed a little too polished for our drab office. The one whose tie never wrinkled and whose laugh lingered just a beat longer than necessary. Sitting at his desk, hunched over papers with a concentration that looked less like work and more like someone hiding from the rest of the world. I should have kept walking. I should have nodded, maybe tossed out a casual burning the midnight oil and escaped into the night. But curiosity has a way of tugging you closer, and before I knew it, I was leaning against the edge of his desk, asking why he was still here. He looked up, startled, like he'd been caught rehearsing a secret, and for a moment his eyes softened in a way that made the sterile office feel too intimate. He shrugged, said something about deadlines, but there was a hesitation in his voice that told me work wasn't the whole story. The office after hours has its own atmosphere. The hum of machines still running, the faint smell of coffee gone stale, the echo of footsteps too loud in hallways meant for daytime chatter. Sitting there with him, the air felt charged, like the building itself was holding its breath. We talked at first about safe things, the project we both hated, the boss's terrible jokes, the vending machine's betrayal and only stocking off-brand chips. But slowly, inevitably, the conversation slid sideways into personal territory. He confessed he liked the quiet, that staying late made him feel like he was outside of time, no expectations, no pretending. I admitted I sometimes stayed behind too, not for work, but to delay going home to an apartment that felt too empty. There's a moment you can feel when small talk tips into something else, when words become confessions and the space between two people shrinks without either of them moving. That moment arrived quietly, wrapped in his low laugh and the way his hand brushed mine as he handed me a pen without looking. I felt it like static, a spark waiting for a touch. We didn't mean to linger, but we did. Minutes turned to hours, the office outside our little island of light disappearing into shadow. At some point he leaned back in his chair, eyes on me in a way that made the room tilt, and asked if I ever wondered what it would be like if we weren't just coworkers. My pulse stumbled. I managed a laugh, tried to deflect with a joke, but the truth was written all over my face. And then, without ceremony, without any of the awkward buildup you expect, he stood, closed the distance, and kissed me. It wasn't tentative, it wasn't a test. It was the kind of kiss that happens when restraint has been straining at the seams for too long, urgent and certain, tasting of coffee and exhaustion and something dangerously alive. I should have stopped it. HR manuals would have screamed at me to stop, but instead I kissed him back, the quiet office walls bearing witness as the hours of unspoken tension unraveled in one impossible, inevitable moment. We didn't go further, not that night. Maybe the flicker of guilt was enough to hold us back, or maybe it was the absurdity of making out beside a printer that still smelled faintly of toner. But when we finally pulled apart, breathless and startled by our own recklessness, he laughed, whispered, "Guess we stayed too long." And for once it didn't sound like a complaint. The next morning the office was full again. Keyboards clattering, phones ringing, and we slipped back into our roles. Professional, polite, nothing to suggest the line we had crossed. But every glance carried weight, every brush of proximity hummed with memory, and the hum of the lights overhead felt like a secret language. It didn't last forever, of course. Things like that rarely do. Maybe it was doomed the moment it began, maybe it was just the wrong time. Maybe we were only ever meant to exist in that suspended pocket of night. But I'll never forget the coworker who stayed. After everyone else went home, the way the ordinary turned extraordinary in the flicker of a desk lamp, the way silence became a confession, The way the hum of an empty office can sound like the start of something you'll carry with you long after the spreadsheets are forgotten. The hotel lobby encounter. That change the trip travel is rarely as glamorous as movies want you to believe. And by the third day of my business trip, I had already resigned myself to the routine of overpriced sandwiches, recycled conference small talk, and the hotel lobby that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and desperation. It was one of those lobbies designed to look luxurious in photos, but felt impersonal in real life. Marble floors that echoed too loudly, faux leather chairs scattered like chess pieces, a fountain that seemed perpetually on the verge of breaking down. I had slumped into one of those chairs after a long day of presentations, laptop bag weighing down my shoulder, mind already drifting toward room service fries, when the revolving door spun and someone walked in who instantly disrupted the monotony. At first, I only noticed because everyone else did. The desk clerk's posture straightened, the bellhop's eyes flicked up, even the tired family waiting for their shuttle seemed to pause mid-squabble. She had that effect, the kind of presence that pulls focus without effort. Dressed not extravagantly, but with a sharp elegance, she carried herself like she belonged everywhere she stepped. And for reasons I can't fully explain, my pulse skipped. I told myself to look away, to return to scrolling aimlessly through emails, but curiosity rooted me in place. She approached the counter, exchanged a few words with the receptionist, and then, instead of heading toward the elevator, she turned and caught me staring. Our eyes locked, and I braced for the awkwardness of being caught, but instead she smiled. Slow, deliberate, a smile that carried an invitation. Against every sensible instinct, I smiled back. That was enough. She walked over, sat in the chair beside mine, and said, as casually as if we'd already been in conversation, "You look like someone who's had a day." I'd laughed, partly from nerves, partly because she wasn't wrong. One question led to another, and suddenly we were talking like old acquaintances, our words spilling into the lobby's stale air while the fountain gurgled in the background. She told me she was in town not for work, but for a much-needed break, escaping a life that sounded both enviable and exhausting. I confessed I was here for the conference, that I hated networking, but liked the anonymity of hotels, that something about the in-between spaces of travel made me feel suspended from reality. The conversation stretched, easy and intoxicating. She asked questions that cut sharper than the small talk I'd been drowning in all week. What I wanted from my work, whether I was happy, who I might be if I let myself change. And I found myself answering honestly, more honestly than I had with anyone in months, maybe years. There was something about her gaze, steady and unflinching, that made pretense impossible. Hours passed without me noticing. The lobby emptied, the desk clerk swapped shifts. Even the fountain finally gave up with a sad wheeze, but still we sat, words curling around us like smoke. Eventually, the conversation dipped into silence, the kind that doesn't strain but hums with possibility. She glanced at the elevators, then back at me, and the air thickened. We didn't make a scene. No dramatic gestures, no sweeping declarations. Just a quiet decision wrapped in a glance. I walked with her to the elevator, each step louder in my ears than the suitcase wheels clattering on marble. Inside, the doors closed, the mirrored walls reflecting back two people suspended in a moment they hadn't expected. She leaned closer, close enough that the scent of her perfume blurred into memory, and whispered, "Sometimes trips don't change you until you let them." Then she kissed me. It wasn't reckless, though maybe it should have been. It was deliberate, lingering, the kind of kiss that rewires something small and permanent inside you. When the doors opened, we parted without words, each stepping into separate hallways like characters exiting stage left and stage right. I thought that would be the end, a strange blip I'd file under travel stories not to be told at family dinners. But the next evening, we found each other again, not by plan, but by gravity. Another conversation in the lobby, another kiss in the elevator, another step deeper into the kind of connection you can't quite categorize. It never became more than that. 2 nights of stolen hours, two people colliding in a space designed for transients. No numbers exchanged, no promises made. When I checked out, I saw her across the lobby, suitcase by her side, and we shared one final smile, soft and knowing before turning away. Back home, the conference blurred into memory, the presentations already forgotten, but the lobby encounter remained vivid. The sound of her laugh, the weight of her questions, the press of her lips in an elevator that smelled faintly of disinfectant. It wasn't love, not even close, but it was something. Something that cracked open the shell of routine. Something that reminded me how alive a chance encounter can make you feel. And so whenever I step into a hotel lobby now, I wonder if the air will hum again, if a stranger might look at me like she did, if fate might decide once more to drop someone extraordinary into the most ordinary place. Because for me, no matter how many trips blur together, there will always be the hotel lobby encounter that changed the trip. The bridesmaid's toast that revealed a little too much. Every wedding has that one moment everyone remembers. Sometimes it's the vows, sometimes it's the first dance. Sometimes it's the cake collapse that nobody admits they secretly enjoyed. But for this wedding, the memory carved itself into history not because of flowers or food or music, but because of a microphone in the hand of a bridesmaid who could not resist letting the truth slip out between sips of champagne. The day had started beautifully, the sun streaming through stained glass windows in the little chapel. The bride radiant in lace and satin, the groom looking dapper enough to appear in a magazine and about cufflinks, family and friends gathered in rows like eager witnesses to happily ever after. The ceremony itself was flawless. No fainting, no forgotten rings, just vows spoken with trembling voices and a kiss so perfectly timed it made half the crowd tear up. Then came the reception, held in a grand hall with fairy lights strung across wooden beams, long tables set with flowers and shades of blush and ivory, and a dance floor that seemed to shimmer with anticipation. Everyone ate, everyone drank, and everyone waited for the speeches, that dangerous yet beloved tradition where loved ones are invited to hand over stories in the name of sentiment and comedy. The maid of honor went first, delivering a heartfelt tale of childhood friendship, embarrassing teenage adventures, and how the bride had always known what she wanted, even if what she wanted in middle school was to marry a pop star whose name she'd written in glitter pen on her math binder. It was sweet. It was safe. It drew polite laughter and a few tears. Then the best man spoke, cracking jokes about the groom's college years, his questionable cooking skills, and his obsessive love of a football team that never won, but ending with a warm reminder that marriage was about loyalty and laughter. Everyone clapped. The DJ cued soft music, and the evening might have carried on as planned if not for the third speech. One of the bridesmaids, let's call her Rachel, had asked if she could say a few words. Nobody thought much of it. She was a close friend of the bride, not the maid of honor, but important enough to want a moment on the mic. She stood, glass in hand, wobbling just slightly in her heels, and began. At first it was charming enough, recalling how she and the bride had met in college, how they'd spent nights staying up too late, studying half as much as they gossiped, how she'd been there for the bride's first heartbreak and her second and her third. People laughed, nodded, sipped their drinks. But then Rachel's tone shifted. Her voice softened, her eyes grew glassy, and she turned her gaze directly at the groom. "And then," she said, her words curling like smoke, "she met you, and I knew I had lost her." The crowd chuckled nervously, assuming it was just a joke about friendship. But Rachel kept going, her grip on the microphone tightening like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I mean," she continued, I always thought maybe she'd choose me. You know? Because she always said I understood her better than anyone. And I believed that. I believed it for years." The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear the candles flicker. The bride froze, her smile faltering into something brittle while the groom blinked like he'd just been slapped with a bouquet. Guests shifted in their seats, some gasping, some trying to stifle laughter, others staring at their wine glasses as if begging them for answers. Rachel, oblivious to the carnage, pressed on. "I just want you both to know," she slurred slightly, "that I'm happy for you. Really, I am. I mean, I'm not the one standing there holding her hand, but I'll always love her, and I'll always be here. even if it should have been me. The DJ, bless him, tried to save the moment by fading in music, but Rachel refused to surrender the mic, her confession spilling into the speakers until one of the groomsmen gently pried it from her hands. She sat down heavily, drained the rest of her champagne, and left a silence hanging over the hall like a chandelier threatening to fall. The bride's face was pale, the groom's jaw tight, and the rest of us tried to pretend we hadn't just witnessed a soap opera unfold live. For the rest of the night, the air never fully recovered. Guests whispered furiously at tables, inventing theories, debating whether it had been a joke gone too far or a genuine confession. Some people insisted they'd always noticed Rachel looking at the bride a little differently. Others swore it was all just the alcohol talking. The bride and groom danced their first dance, but their smiles looked strained, and more than one guest kept sneaking glances at Rachel, who swayed drunkenly near the bar, eyes glassy, muttering to anyone who would listen about how love was complicated. By the end of the evening, Rachel had vanished, escorted out by another bridesmaid who looked both mortified and exhausted, and the wedding limped toward its conclusion. The cake was cut, the bouquet was tossed, but the magic had dimmed, replaced by the lingering echo of her words. And in the weeks that followed, the story spread. It was retold at brunches, rehashed in group chats, dissected by relatives who hadn't even been there but somehow already had opinions. The couple stayed together, though rumors swirled for months about tension and arguments and awkward dinners where Rachel's name hung in the air unspoken. Some friendships fractured, others grew stronger in the chaos, but the night itself became legend. Nobody remembered the exact flavor of the cake or the playlist the DJ spun, but everyone remembered the bridesmaid's toast that revealed a little too much. And now, every time I attend a wedding, I wait nervously during the toast, wine glass clutched like a shield, because I know that behind every heartfelt speech lurks the possibility of confession, of secrets, of too much truth spilled in the glow of fairy lights. Weddings promise love, but sometimes they also promise drama. And sometimes, all it takes is one bridesmaid, one microphone, and one too many glasses of champagne to turn happily ever after into a story nobody forgets. The weekend wedding, where the wrong people shared a room. Weddings that last a whole weekend are dangerous by design. They start with the best of intentions: a Friday night welcome dinner, a Saturday morning of coordinated activities, a Saturday evening ceremony, and a Sunday brunch send-off, all wrapped in the idea that people will bond, drink responsibly, and behave themselves for 48 hours straight. But of course, people are not built for that. And the longer you keep them in one place with free alcohol and limited privacy, the more likely it is that something will go gloriously off script. This particular wedding was held at a sprawling country inn that had once been a working estate, complete with creaky floors, ivy climbing the walls, and rooms that smelled faintly of lavender and history. Because it was far from the city, most of the guests stayed on site, and the inn staff had taken on the impossible task of distributing dozens of cousins, co-workers, and friends across mismatched rooms that varied wildly in size and charm. Some got grand suites with clawfoot tubs, others got broom closet-sized singles, and everyone accepted it with the mild resignation of people who knew they'd be spending more time at the bar than in their beds. The mistake, however, came with the room assignments, a simple clerical error that somehow planted the seeds of chaos. 2 keys, 2 envelopes, 2 guests who were not supposed to share anything more than polite conversation, and yet by Saturday afternoon they discovered they'd been booked into the same room. One was the bride's college roommate, a sharp-witted woman with a fondness for red wine and sarcasm, and the other was the groom's cousin, a man with a reputation for charm that bordered on recklessness. They arrived separately, each hauling bags, each assuming the other had stumbled into the wrong space, until they compared keys and realized the hotel had declared them temporary roommates. At first they did the sensible thing, marched to the front desk, demanded a fix, only to be told with apologetic smiles that the inn was full to bursting, not a spare bed in sight, and housekeeping had already pushed cots to the limit. The best they could do, the clerk explained, was to send extra pillows and hope for the best. Neither was pleased, but neither wanted to make a scene, so they agreed on boundaries. She'd take the bed, he'd take the chaise lounge. They'd politely ignore each other until Sunday. That plan lasted exactly 6 hours. By dinner, the reception of the welcome party was in full swing, and champagne has a way of making boundaries porous. The two of them found themselves standing side by side at the buffet, laughing at the absurdity of the situation, teasing about who snored louder, who'd be kicked out first, and somehow that laughter followed them back upstairs. The inn's walls were thin, the night air heavy with crickets and distant music, and when they opened the door to their shared room, it felt less like a mistake and more like a dare. They talked first, sitting on opposite sides of the bed, the kind of tipsy conversation that ranges from childhood pets to secret fears, words spilling because silence felt heavier than truth. Then the chaise lounge was dismissed as uncomfortable, then a joke about "don't cross the line" turned into a challenge, then the line blurred entirely. By the time the clock chimed midnight, the bride's roommate and the groom's cousin had crossed from accidental roommates to something else entirely, and the inn's creaky floors bore witness to a secret no seating chart could predict. The next morning, they tried to act normal. They dressed quietly, avoided eye contact, descended to breakfast with polite smiles. But people notice things at weddings, especially at close quarters. Someone remarked on how they arrived at the same time. Someone else caught the way their hands brushed too easily. And by the time the ceremony rolled around, whispers were already circulating. The bride, radiant in lace, didn't notice at first, but her maid of honor did, and so did the groom's aunt, who had an uncanny radar for impropriety. By the reception, the rumor had matured into certainty. The two culprits tried to mingle separately, but weddings pull people together, and more than once they were caught laughing at the same joke. Standing too close at the bar, disappearing from the dance floor at the same time. When the bouquet toss came, she caught it. An accident, she swore later, but the crowd roared with teasing cheers, and his smirk across the room did nothing to help their case. The truth exploded that night when someone knocked on their door by mistake, looking for extra aspirin, and found them not in separate sleeping arrangements, but tangled together in unmistakable disarray. By morning, half the inn knew. The bride, to her credit, laughed it off in disbelief, muttering something about how at least they weren't technically related, while the groom groaned about family reunions never being the same again. By Sunday brunch, the scandal had eclipsed the vows, the cake, and even the spectacular first dance that had nearly set the hem of the bride's dress on fire. Guests clinked mimosas with sly grins, the staff traded gossip in the kitchen, and the two in question showed up late, hair slightly tousled, eyes refusing to meet anyone else's. Nobody said it outright, but everyone knew. And when the weekend ended and the guests departed, the wedding was immortalized, not as the one with the country inn charm or the picture-perfect vows, but as the weekend wedding where the wrong people shared a room. Years later, it's still the story that gets told first. People forget the flavor of the cake, the exact flowers in the bouquet, even the name of the DJ, but nobody forgets the scandal of that room. The laughter in the hallways, the whispers over coffee. Some weddings are remembered for romance, others for disaster, but the best stories, the ones retold with sly smiles and shaking heads, are remembered for both. And this one, this messy, hilarious, too-human story, was the kind that turned a weekend of vows into legend. The New Year's Eve. Kiss that wasn't supposed to happen. New Year's Eve has a way of magnifying everything. Every glance, every laugh, every drink, poured into a plastic cup that feels more glamorous than it should. And that night was no exception. The city glittering like it had been dressed for the occasion, the streets crowded with people clutching noisemakers and resolutions they wouldn't keep. While inside the loft apartment where I'd been invited, the party pulsed with music. Fairy lights strung across exposed beams, and the hum of 100 conversations overlapping in a chorus of anticipation. I hadn't planned on anything more than ringing in the new year with friends. Maybe a clink of champagne, maybe a sleepy ride home in the back of a rideshare, but the universe, as usual, had other plans. The loft was packed, warm from too many bodies, and the radiator that clicked like it was complaining. People draped on couches, leaning against walls, crowding the makeshift dance floor in the kitchen. I floated between groups, sipping my drink, laughing at jokes that weren't that funny when I saw him across the room. We'd known each other for years, orbiting the same circles, always just outside the edge of possibility. Timing off, circumstances messy, that unspoken awareness tucked away like a note in a pocket. He was leaning against the window, city lights spilling around him, talking to someone but glancing away as if restless. When his eyes caught mine, it was like the countdown had started early. We gravitated toward each other, casual at first, polite greetings wrapped in banter, the kind of conversation you can have in a crowded room without anyone else noticing the shift in tone. But I noticed. So did he. Yeah, music thumped, people danced, drinks spilled, and somehow we kept ending up in the same orbit. His hand brushing my arm when he leaned closer to say something. My laugh too quick, too bright at his jokes. Friends passed by, oblivious, tossing confetti in our hair and shoving more drinks into our hands, and all the while the clock crept closer to midnight. There's something about those last minutes of the year when people cluster together, eyes glued to the television or the phone countdown, hearts racing with a mixture of nostalgia and hope. Someone shouted, 10 minutes! And the room buzzed louder, couples finding each other, friends huddling for selfies, everyone jockeying for their spot at midnight. He and I ended up near the balcony, pressed closer by the crowd, the cold air seeping in through the glass door. We talked about resolutions, the silly kind. He swore he'd finally learned to cook something other than pasta. I swore I'd stop killing houseplants. But under the jokes was a hum, a tension that made my chest ache. When the countdown began, 10, 9, 8, the noise was deafening. Voices and laughter and music all crashing together. And I told myself I'd be sensible, that at midnight I'd clink glasses with friends, cheer, smile, and leave it at that. 7, 6, 5. The crowd swayed, glitter falling from someone's popper. My hand brushed his, and instead of pulling away, I left it there. 4, 3. The noise dimmed around me, the room blurring, my pulse louder than the shouts. 2, 1. Midnight. And then his lips were on mine. Not planned, not discussed, not even rational, just inevitable. Like the kiss had been waiting through every missed chance and wrong moment, until the universe wrapped it in fireworks and handed it to us. The noise exploded around us. Cheers, clinking glasses, someone screaming, "Happy New Year," loud enough to wake the dead. But all I felt was the press of his mouth, the warmth of his hand at the back of my neck, the way the kiss deepened before either of us could think better of it. It wasn't polite, it wasn't restrained, it was messy and real and exactly what it shouldn't have been. Because here's the part that complicates the story. He wasn't mine to kiss. He wasn't exactly someone else's either, not officially, but there were boundaries, expectations, that invisible web of relationships and loyalties that made the kiss less about celebration and more about crossing a line. And yet, in that moment, none of it mattered. Midnight had cracked the world open, and we'd stepped through. When we pulled apart, the room was still roaring, confetti in our hair, champagne spilling onto the floor, but between us there was a silence so loud it drowned everything else. His eyes searched mine, asking 1,000 questions neither of us could answer, and I laughed, too bright, too shaky to cover the quake in my chest. "Happy New Year," I whispered, and he echoed it, voice low, like the words meant something more. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Friends hugged, photos were taken, resolutions shouted into the air, and we slipped back into the crowd, careful not to linger too close, careful not to draw attention. But every glance carried the memory of that kiss. Every accidental brush of shoulders hummed with it. When the party finally thinned, people stumbling out into the cold night, he walked me to the door, our friends waving drunken goodbyes, and for a moment I thought he might say something monumental. Instead, he just touched my arm, soft, fleeting, and let me go. In the weeks that followed, the kiss hung between us like smoke, unspoken but always present. We saw each other at gatherings, exchanged polite smiles, but the air was different, charged. Sometimes I wondered if it had been a mistake, if the champagne and the countdown and the magic of midnight had woven an illusion. But sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet, I knew it wasn't a mistake at all. It was the truth, slipping out in the only way it could. And so every December, when the clock ticks down and people raise their glasses, I think about the New Year's Eve kiss that wasn't supposed to happen, about how time has a way of collapsing in on itself, how fireworks and confetti can cover sins, and how sometimes the first moment of a new year isn't about resolutions or clean slates. Sometimes it's about the secret you carry into January, the one kiss that wasn't supposed to happen but did, and how it changes everything, even if nobody else ever knows. The road trip where the motel had only one bed. Road trips always sound better in theory. You imagine windows rolled down, your favorite playlist blasting, gas station snacks spread across your lap like a feast, conversations that range from ridiculous to profound while the scenery unfolds like a movie reel. But the reality is usually traffic is sore backs and someone forgetting to charge their phone at the worst possible moment. This trip was a little of both, the messy and the magical, and it was supposed to be purely platonic. Just two friends heading cross country to save money on flights and make some memories along the way. We'd known each other for years, always dancing just on the edge of something more, but never quite tipping over. Partly because timing was cruel, partly because neither of us wanted to risk ruining the friendship. But miles have a way of wearing down barriers, and by the time we hit our third state line, something in the air between us had shifted. The first 2 nights had been fine. 2 beds in cheap motels, each of us crashing exhausted, trading jokes in the dark before drifting off. But on the third night, somewhere in the middle of nowhere after a detour that doubled our driving time, we pulled into a roadside motel with a flickering neon sign and a front desk clerk who looked like he'd been there since the Nixon administration. He gave us one key, one room, and when we opened the door, we found it. A single bed. Not even a big one, just a queen, wedged between nightstands with floral sheets that smelled faintly of bleach and air freshener. We stood there in the doorway, staring at it like it was a trap. He laughed first, a short, nervous chuckle, muttering, "Of course." And I tried to play it cool, tossing my bag on the chair, pretending this was no big deal. But the truth hummed under my skin. One bed, one night, 2 people who had spent years pretending there was nothing else lurking between them. We tried to ignore it at first, went out for greasy diner food, sat across from each other in a booth with peeling vinyl seats, talking about everything except the obvious. He teased me about my French fry obsession. I teased him about the way he always managed to spill something on himself. And for a little while, it felt like any other night. But back at the motel, when we brushed our teeth side by side in the tiny bathroom, our shoulders bumping in the mirror, the tension was impossible to laugh away. Climbing into that bed was like stepping into a dare. We lay stiffly, a gulf of space between us, both pretending to scroll on our phones, both hyper-aware of every movement. The room was too quiet, the hum of the old air conditioner loud in its effort, and eventually he sighed, set his phone down, and whispered, "This is ridiculous, right?" I laughed, agreed, rolled onto my side to face him, and in that dim motel light, everything we'd avoided saying hovered in the air. He asked if I'd ever thought about us, and I admitted I had, more times than I could count. He admitted the same, that he'd wondered what it would be like but never wanted to risk losing me. And in that moment, with the hum of the AC and the smell of bleach, and the thin walls carrying the sound of trucks on the highway, all the years of hesitation crumbled. He leaned closer, slowly enough to let me pull away if I wanted, and when I didn't, his lips found mine. The kiss wasn't polished, it wasn't cinematic. It was messy with laughter and nerves, but it was real. More real than anything we'd ever tried to bury. One kiss turned into another, then another, and soon the space between us vanished. The bed was small, the sheets scratchy, the pillows lumpy, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that, after years of circling each other, we'd finally collided. We didn't sleep much that night, not because of noise or discomfort, but because every hour felt too precious to waste. We talked in whispers, kissed between confessions, held onto each other like we were afraid daylight might undo it all. And when morning came, sunlight creeping through the thin curtains, neither of us wanted to move. The rest of the trip felt different, lighter, freer. We still argued about music choices, still fought over snacks, still laughed until our stomachs hurt, but there was no more pretending. His hand found mine on the gear shift. My head rested on his shoulder at rest stops, and when we finally rolled into our final destination, it felt less like the end of a trip and more like the start of something we'd both been waiting for. Now, whenever someone mentions road trips, I smile because I don't think of traffic or fast food or bad motels. I think of the road trip where the motel had only one bed, the night that turned an accident into inevitability, the night when two friends stopped circling and finally let themselves fall. And maybe it wasn't perfect, maybe it wasn't planned, but sometimes the best stories begin with a wrong room and a single bed in the middle of nowhere.